in the vast tapestry of time. Few stories span millennia with such profound consequence as the Avatar cycle, from the primordial clash between light and darkness to the birth of nations, from the first Avatar's sacrifice to the modern age of spirits and technology. This chronicle traces the eternal dance of balance and chaos. Each Avatar carried the weight of their world's destiny, their choices echoing through generations yet to come. Tonight, we journey through 10,000 years of triumph and tragedy, wisdom and folly, as we explore the complete timeline of the Avatar universe. Let the ancient voices guide you through this epic saga of elemental mastery and human spirit, thousands of years before recorded history began, when the world existed in a state of pure spiritual energy. The fundamental forces that would shape all existence emerged from the cosmic void. In this primordial realm, two opposing entities manifested as the eternal embodiment of light and darkness, order and chaos, creation and destruction. Rava, the spirit of light and peace, radiated with the gentle luminescence of pure harmony, while Vatu, the spirit of darkness and chaos, pulsed with the raw energy of unbridled change and discord. These ancient beings were not merely spirits, but the living representation of the universe's most fundamental principles. Their existence predated human civilization, predated the very concept of nations or bending, existing in a cosmic dance that had continued since the dawn of time itself. Neither could exist without the other, for light defined itself against darkness, and peace found meaning only in contrast to chaos. Their eternal struggle represented the delicate balance that maintained the fabric of reality. The world they inhabited bore little resemblance to the one that would later house the four nations. Spirits roamed freely between realms, their essence flowing like water between the physical and spiritual planes. No barriers existed to separate these dimensions, creating a landscape where the impossible became mundane and the mystical merged seamlessly with the material. In this age of wonders, massive creatures beyond human comprehension walked the earth, their very presence reshaping mountains and valleys with each footstep. Among these magnificent beings, the lion turtles stood as gentle giants, their shells forming vast continents that drifted slowly across endless oceans. These ancient creatures possessed wisdom accumulated over countless millennia, understanding the delicate relationship between spiritual energy and physical form. Their shells provided sanctuary for the earliest forms of human life. Small communities that huddled together in the shadow of these benevolent protectors. The lion turtles recognized humanity's potential, but understood their fragility in a world dominated by spiritual forces beyond mortal comprehension. The relationship between humans and lion turtles developed into something beautiful and symbiotic. These massive creatures offered protection and guidance, while humans provided companionship and purpose. The lion turtles observed how humans learned and adapted, their curiosity driving them to explore beyond the safety of their shell cities. When humans ventured into the dangerous wilds populated by hostile spirits, the lion turtles granted temporary gifts of elemental power, bestowing the ability to manipulate fire, earth, water, or air as protection against the supernatural threats that lurked beyond their sanctuary. This system created the first glimpse of what would later become known as bending, though it differed dramatically from the art forms that would develop in later ages. The power granted by lion turtles was temporary and utilitarian, designed solely for survival rather than mastery or expression. When humans returned from their expeditions, the elemental abilities were reclaimed by their protectors, ensuring that such dangerous forces remained under careful control. No human possessed permanent access to these powers, and the very concept of mastering multiple elements remained unthinkable. During this era, the eternal conflict between Rava and Vatu continued, with neither gaining permanent advantage over the other. Their battles raged across both physical and spiritual realms, creating phenomena that defied natural law. When Rava gained ascendancy, the world experienced periods of unprecedented harmony, with spirits and the few humans living in peaceful coexistence. During Vatu's dominance, chaos reigned supreme as dark spirits emerged to terrorize all living beings, their corruption spreading like a plague across the landscape. The cycle of their conflict followed cosmic patterns that transcended mortal understanding. Every 10,000 years, during an event known as harmonic convergence, the spiritual energy of the universe reached its peak intensity. The planets aligned in perfect harmony, opening portals between the physical and spirit worlds and amplifying the power of all supernatural forces. During these rare celestial events, the outcome of Rava and Vatu's eternal struggle would determine the spiritual climate of the world for the next 10 millennia. As one such convergence approached 19,000 years before the air nomad genocide, the stakes of their cosmic battle reached unprecedented heights. The very nature of existence hung in the balance as these fundamental forces prepared for their ultimate confrontation. The spirit portals at the north and south poles began to resonate with increasing intensity, their energy creating auroras that painted the sky in brilliant displays of supernatural light. Even the normally peaceful spirits sensed the approaching climax, gathering in vast numbers to witness an event that would reshape their entire reality. The lion turtles, ancient witnesses to countless such convergences, prepared their human charges for the coming upheaval. They understood that this particular harmonic convergence would differ from all previous ones, sensing changes in the cosmic fabric that suggested their role as humanity's protectors might soon come to an end. The humans themselves remained largely unaware of the greater forces at work, focused on their daily struggles for survival and the small joys found within their protected communities. During this fateful convergence, Rava and Vatu clashed with unprecedented fury, their battle sending shock waves through both realms that fundamentally altered the nature of existence itself. Mountains crumbled and reformed under the pressure of their conflict, while new land masses emerged from the depths of ancient oceans. The very air crackled with spiritual energy as reality itself bent under the strain of their opposing forces. When the cosmic dust finally settled, Rava emerged victorious from this primordial battle. Her triumph ensuring that light and peace would guide the world for the next 10,000 years. Vatu, weakened but not destroyed, was bound within the spiritual realm, his influence contained but never completely eliminated. This victory created a period of relative stability that would allow human civilization to flourish and develop beyond their dependence on lion turtle protection. The aftermath of this convergence marked the beginning of humanity's true independence. The lion turtles, recognizing that their protective role was no longer necessary in a world where light had triumphed over darkness, began to withdraw from their intimate involvement in human affairs. They continued to offer guidance and temporary elemental gifts to those who sought them, but they no longer served as the primary guardians of human civilization. Human communities began to develop their own unique cultures and traditions during this period of unprecedented peace. Each lion turtle city evolved distinct customs, languages, and ways of life, creating the foundation for what would eventually become the diverse nations of the future. Trade and communication between cities flourished as brave explorers ventured across the vast oceans, sharing knowledge and resources between distant settlements. The temporary elemental gifts provided by lion turtles began to influence human culture in profound ways. Communities that frequently received firebending gifts developed traditions centered around warmth, energy, and transformation. Those granted earthbending abilities created societies that valued stability, strength, and endurance. Waterbending gifts inspired cultures focused on adaptability, healing, and the cycles of life, while airbending abilities encouraged communities that prized freedom, spirituality, and detachment from material concerns. These cultural developments laid the groundwork for the eventual emergence of the four nations. Though thousands of years would pass before the current world order established itself, the seeds of bending philosophy, national identity, and spiritual understanding were planted during this ancient age of lion turtle guardianship, growing slowly but steadily toward their eventual flowering. As this era drew to a close, the stage was set for one of the most significant events in the history of the Avatar universe. Among the humans living under lion turtle protection, one individual would soon emerge whose actions would fundamentally alter the relationship between spirits and mortals, creating the Avatar cycle that would guide the world through all the ages to come. The story of Wan, the first Avatar, began in these final days of the old world, when humanity stood on the threshold of independence and the cosmos prepared for another fundamental transformation. In the year 9850, before the air nomad genocide, a child was born who would forever alter the relationship between spirits and humanity. Wan entered the world during an age when humans still lived under the protection of the great lion turtles, their existence dependent on the wisdom and benevolence of these ancient creatures. His birth occurred in one of the great shell cities where firebending was the elemental gift bestowed upon those brave enough to venture into the dangerous wilds beyond their sanctuary. The city of Wan's birth reflected the harsh realities of early human civilization, where social hierarchies determined one's fate from the moment of arrival into the world. The wealthy Cho family controlled much of the city's resources and political power, their influence extending into every aspect of daily life. They lived in magnificent structures built into the highest reaches of the lion turtle's shell, where cool breezes and spectacular views reminded them daily of their elevated status. Below them, in the cramped and shadowy lower levels, families like Juan's struggled to survive on whatever scraps and opportunities the ruling class deemed fit to share. Juan's childhood unfolded in the perpetual twilight of the city's lowest tiers, where sunlight rarely penetrated and hope seemed as scarce as food. His parents worked tirelessly in whatever menial jobs they could find, their hands worn raw from constant labor that barely provided enough to keep their small family fed. The contrast between their daily struggle and the obvious abundance enjoyed by those above created a burning sense of injustice that grew stronger within Juan with each passing year. By his 18th year, Juan had formed close bonds with other young people who shared his circumstances and frustrations. Together, they developed increasingly bold schemes to redistribute some of the wealth that seemed so unfairly concentrated among the elite. Their activities began with small acts of petty theft, taking food from markets or supplies from wealthy households, always justifying their actions as necessary for survival. The Cho family members and their associates seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating these lower-class youth, treating them as little more than animals deserving of scorn and punishment. The systematic oppression and casual cruelty displayed by the ruling class eventually drove Juan to more desperate measures. He began to dream of acquiring real power, the kind that could fundamentally change the social order of their city. The temporary firebending abilities granted by their lion turtle protector represented the closest thing to such power that he could imagine, and he observed carefully how the selection process worked for those chosen to venture beyond the city's borders. When an opportunity finally arose to join a hunting expedition into the spirit wilds, Juan seized it without hesitation. The lion turtle, following ancient traditions, bestowed upon him the temporary gift of firebending, warning him, as it did all humans, that the power must be returned upon his safe arrival back to the city. The sensation of elemental mastery coursed through Juan's body like liquid fire, awakening possibilities he had never imagined and filling him with a sense of capability that transcended his humble origins. The hunting party ventured into landscapes that defied mortal understanding, where trees grew in impossible spirals and the very air shimmered with spiritual energy. Juan marveled at his newfound abilities, practicing flame manipulation whenever the group stopped to rest. The power felt natural in his hands, as though he had been born to wield such forces. As they prepared to return to the city, a desperate plan began forming in his mind. Through careful misdirection and timing, Juan managed to avoid the lion turtle's attempt to reclaim his firebending abilities upon their return. He concealed himself among returning expedition members, slipping past the ancient creature's awareness while maintaining his connection to the elemental power. For the first time in human history, someone had successfully retained bending abilities beyond their intended duration. Though Juan remained unaware of the unprecedented nature of his achievement, with firebending at his command, Juan felt ready to challenge the social order that had oppressed him and countless others throughout their lives. He revealed his abilities to his closest friends and began planning a revolution that would overthrow the Cho family's dominance. The flames that danced around his fingers seemed to promise a future where merit and courage would matter more than accident of birth, where those who had suffered could finally claim their rightful place in society. The rebellion began with spectacular displays of Juan's impossible abilities, his fire attacks overwhelming the guards and enforcers who had long terrorized the lower classes. The sight of someone from their own ranks wielding such power inspired others to join the uprising, creating a momentum that threatened to topple the established order entirely. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though Juan's vision of justice might actually come to pass. However, the lion turtle that had granted Juan his abilities soon discovered the deception. The ancient creature's disappointment was profound, not merely because of the theft itself, but because of the violation of trust it represented. For countless generations, humans had honored the agreement to return their temporary powers, understanding that such gifts came with serious responsibilities. Juan's actions represented a fundamental breach of the sacred covenant between humans and their protectors. When confronted with evidence of his deception, Juan initially attempted to justify his actions by explaining the injustices he sought to correct. He spoke passionately about the suffering of the poor, the arrogance of the wealthy, and his desire to create a more equitable society. The lion turtle listened patiently to these arguments, its ancient eyes reflecting both understanding and sorrow. While the creature sympathized with Juan's motivations, it could not overlook the betrayal of trust that had made his rebellion possible. The punishment for Juan's crime was banishment from the only home he had ever known, exile into the dangerous spirit wilds where hostile entities waited to prey upon any human foolish enough to venture unprepared into their domain. However, recognizing both the sincerity of Juan's intentions and the unique circumstances of his case, the lion turtle made an unprecedented decision. Rather than reclaiming his firebending abilities before exile, the ancient creature allowed Juan to retain them as protection against the dangers he would face in the wilderness. This act of mercy would prove to have consequences far beyond what anyone could have imagined, setting in motion events that would reshape the fundamental nature of existence itself. As Juan gathered his few possessions and prepared to leave the only life he had ever known, he carried with him not only his stolen fire, but also a burning determination to prove that his actions had been justified, that the power he had claimed could be used for purposes greater than personal gain. The spirit wilds that became Juan's new home existed as a realm where the normal laws of nature held little sway. Ancient trees twisted into impossible configurations, while streams flowed uphill and the very ground shifted beneath his feet with each passing day. Spirits of every description populated this supernatural landscape, from tiny wisps of barely perceptible energy to massive creatures whose presence could be felt from miles away. Most viewed humans as unwelcome intruders in their domain, beings whose very existence represented a corruption of the natural order. Juan's early days in exile were marked by constant danger and near starvation as he struggled to adapt to an environment for which his city upbringing had provided no preparation. His firebending abilities proved essential for survival, allowing him to create warmth during the bitter nights and defend himself against the more aggressive spirits that viewed him as either a threat or a meal. The power that had once symbolized his rebellion against social injustice now served the more basic function of keeping him alive from one day to the next. During one particularly harrowing encounter with a group of spirit hunters from his former city, Juan witnessed the casual cruelty with which humans often treated the supernatural beings that shared their world. These hunters had captured a young cat deer, a gentle spirit creature that posed no threat to anyone, intending to kill it purely for sport. The sight of such unnecessary violence awakened something protective within Juan, and he used his firebending to drive off the hunters and free their captive. The rescued cat deer, whom Juan named Mula, became his first true friend in the spirit wilds. This small act of kindness began to change how other spirits viewed the young exile, demonstrating that not all humans were driven by the same destructive impulses. Mula possessed an innate understanding of the spirit world's geography and dangers, guiding Juan to sources of food and water while helping him avoid the most hostile supernatural entities that populated their shared realm. As months passed, Juan's relationship with the spirit world deepened in ways he had never expected. He learned to communicate with beings whose existence operated according to principles entirely foreign to human understanding, discovering that many spirits were not inherently malicious, but simply protective of their territory and suspicious of human intentions. His willingness to defend them against hunters and other threats gradually earned him acceptance among some of the wild's more benevolent inhabitants. The most significant of these relationships developed with a magnificent white dragon, an ancient spirit whose wisdom spanned thousands of years and whose mastery of firebending far exceeded anything Juan had imagined possible. This dragon had observed the young human's journey with growing interest, recognizing something unique in his approach to both spirits and elemental manipulation. Unlike previous humans who had received temporary fire gifts, Juan demonstrated a natural affinity for the element that suggested deeper possibilities. Under the white dragon's patient tutelage, Juan began to understand firebending not merely as a tool for survival or dominance, but as an art form that required discipline, respect, and harmony with the element's essential nature. The dragon taught him techniques that would later become known as the dancing dragon form, movements that flowed like flame itself and channeled fire's creative rather than destructive potential. These lessons transformed Juan's crude, survival-based bending into something approaching true mastery. The white dragon also shared wisdom about the larger forces at work in their world, speaking of the eternal struggle between order and chaos, light and darkness that shaped all existence. Through these conversations, Juan began to understand that his own journey was connected to cosmic principles far greater than his personal desire for justice or revenge against those who had wronged him. The dragon sensed that Juan's destiny extended beyond survival in the spirit wilds, though the exact nature of that destiny remained hidden even from its ancient perception. After 2 years of growth and learning in this supernatural realm, Juan's understanding of both himself and the world around him had been fundamentally transformed. The angry young man who had stolen fire to fuel his rebellion had evolved into someone capable of seeing beyond immediate grievances to larger patterns of harmony and discord. His relationship with Mula and the other spirits had taught him that cooperation and mutual respect could achieve more than conflict and domination. It was during this period of relative peace and personal growth that Juan encountered the cosmic forces that would define the rest of his existence and reshape the nature of reality itself. Deep within the spirit wilds, in a grove where ancient energies had concentrated for millennia, he discovered 2 beings locked in eternal combat. The sight that greeted him defied mortal comprehension as Rava and Vatu, the fundamental spirits of light and darkness, struggled against each other with power that made his own firebending seem insignificant by comparison. The dark spirit Vatu, sensing an opportunity in the presence of this unique human, began to speak to Juan with words that seemed to emanate from the very shadows around them. Vatu painted a picture of cosmic injustice, describing how Rava had imprisoned him unfairly and prevented the natural balance between order and chaos from functioning properly. The dark spirit claimed to be a victim of Rava's tyranny, seeking only freedom to fulfill his rightful role in maintaining universal equilibrium. Juan's experiences with social injustice and his natural sympathy for the oppressed made him receptive to Vatu's arguments. The dark spirit's words resonated with his own memories of powerlessness and his desire to correct imbalances wherever he found them. Without fully understanding the cosmic significance of his actions, Juan made a decision that would echo through 10,000 years of history. Using his firebending abilities, he severed the bonds that held Vatu captive, releasing darkness and chaos back into a world that had known relative peace for millennia. The immediate consequences of Juan's intervention exceeded his worst nightmares, as Vatu's liberation unleashed forces of corruption and discord that spread across both the physical and spirit worlds like a plague. Peaceful spirits throughout the wilds were transformed into dark, twisted versions of themselves, their benevolent nature corrupted by the chaotic energy that now flowed freely through their realm. The harmony that had characterized Juan's recent life shattered as former friends became enemies and familiar landscapes turned hostile and threatening. Rava, weakened by her long struggle against Vatu and now facing him at full strength, could barely maintain her own existence as darkness spread unchecked across the world. When she encountered Juan, her anger at his interference was tempered by recognition of his genuine remorse and his desperate desire to undo the damage he had caused. The spirit of light explained the true nature of her conflict with Vatu, helping Juan understand that he had not freed an unjustly imprisoned victim, but had unleashed a fundamental force of destruction upon an unprepared world. The weight of cosmic responsibility settled upon Juan's shoulders as he grasped the magnitude of his mistake and the suffering it had brought to countless innocent beings. However, rather than succumb to despair or attempt to flee from the consequences of his actions, Juan made another decision that would prove equally significant. He offered his aid to Rava in whatever form she would accept, dedicating his life to correcting the imbalance he had created and restoring peace to a world torn apart by chaotic forces. Initially, Rava rejected Juan's offer, believing that human involvement had already caused enough damage to the cosmic order. However, as Vatu's influence continued to spread and her own strength waned under the constant assault of dark energy, she began to reconsider. The approaching harmonic convergence would amplify both their powers exponentially, but Vatu's current advantage suggested that he would emerge victorious from their final confrontation unless something fundamental changed in the cosmic equation. The solution that emerged from their desperate collaboration would create something entirely new in the history of the universe. As they worked together to combat the spreading darkness, Rava began to pass through Juan's body, temporarily merging their energies to grant him access to other elemental powers beyond his stolen fire. This process proved exhausting for both participants, requiring perfect synchronization between human will and spiritual energy to achieve even temporary success. Their first joint intervention came when a group of airbenders found their lion turtle city under assault by spirits corrupted by Vatu's influence. Juan and Rava arrived to find the situation desperate, with the lion turtle's own abilities proving insufficient against the supernatural assault. Working together, they managed to drive off the dark spirits and protect the city's inhabitants, demonstrating that their unprecedented partnership could achieve results neither could accomplish alone. Inspired by this success and recognizing the potential for even greater cooperation, Juan sought out other lion turtle cities to request training in the remaining elemental arts. The ancient creatures, understanding the cosmic significance of the current crisis, agreed to grant him access to water, earth, and airbending abilities. However, the human body was never designed to channel multiple elements simultaneously, and only Rava's presence within him made such mastery possible without destroying his physical form. The months leading up to harmonic convergence became a period of intensive training as Juan pushed his abilities to their absolute limits, while Rava guided him in understanding the deeper principles that connected all four elements. Each bending art required not only physical techniques, but also philosophical approaches that reflected the element's essential nature. Fire demanded passion and determination. Earth required patience and stability. Water called for adaptability and compassion, while air needed freedom and spiritual detachment. As harmonic convergence approached, Juan had achieved something unprecedented in human history, mastering all four elements through his unique partnership with the Spirit of Light. However, the true test of their collaboration would come during the cosmic event itself, when the enhanced spiritual energy would either allow them to defeat Vatu or result in darkness consuming the entire world. The stakes could not have been higher. As they prepared to face a force of chaos that had grown stronger with each passing day since its liberation, the final confrontation between light and darkness would determine not only the fate of the current world, but also establish patterns that would shape reality for thousands of years to come. Juan understood that his actions had initiated this crisis, and only through the ultimate sacrifice could he hope to restore the balance he had so catastrophically disrupted. The stage was set for the birth of the Avatar cycle and the creation of a new cosmic order that would bridge the gap between human and spirit worlds forever. The harmonic convergence that witnessed Juan's fusion with Rava marked not merely the birth of the first Avatar, but the beginning of an entirely new chapter in the relationship between human and spirit world. As Juan's mortal form eventually succumbed to age and the accumulated strain of bridging two realms, his spirit merged permanently with Rava's essence, creating an eternal cycle that would guide the world through countless generations yet to come. The Avatar spirit, carrying within it the accumulated wisdom and power of its first incarnation, sought out a new vessel among the newborn children of the world, beginning a pattern that would continue for 10 millennia. The immediate aftermath of Juan's death brought both hope and uncertainty to a world still recovering from the chaos unleashed by Vatu's temporary freedom. The lion turtles, recognizing that their role as humanity's primary protectors had fundamentally changed with the Avatar's emergence, began their gradual withdrawal from direct involvement in human affairs. These ancient beings understood that the time had come for their charges to stand independently, guided by the Avatar's wisdom rather than sheltered beneath protective shells that had defined human existence since the dawn of civilization. This transition period proved challenging for human communities that had grown dependent on their lion turtle guardians for both protection and elemental gifts. As the great creatures slowly departed for distant waters or remote corners of the world, humans found themselves forced to develop new survival strategies and forms of social organization. The temporary bending abilities that had once been granted by lion turtles were no longer available, yet some humans discovered that the elements themselves could serve as teachers for those willing to observe and learn from the natural world around them. The rediscovery of bending arts through natural observation represented one of humanity's greatest intellectual achievements during this era of independence. Small groups of humans, driven by necessity and curiosity, began to study the movements and behaviors of creatures that seemed to possess innate connections to the elements. These early pioneers of bending philosophy approached their studies with reverence and patience, understanding that they were attempting to unlock secrets that had previously been granted only through divine intervention. The first humans to master airbending found their inspiration among the flying bison, majestic creatures whose effortless navigation of wind currents seemed to embody the very essence of freedom and spiritual transcendence. These early airbenders observed how the bison moved in harmony with air currents rather than fighting against them, learning to channel their own spiritual energy. Through movements that mimicked the graceful flight patterns they witnessed daily, The philosophy that emerged from this study emphasized detachment from worldly concerns, spiritual enlightenment, and the interconnectedness of all living things. The nomadic peoples who embraced airbending eventually established temples in remote mountain locations where the wind currents were strongest and the spiritual energy most concentrated. These temples became centers of learning and meditation, their architecture designed to channel and amplify the natural flow of air through chambers and corridors. The airbenders who dwelled in these sacred spaces developed a culture that prized intellectual pursuit, artistic expression, and spiritual development above material accumulation or territorial expansion. Among the most legendary of these early airbending masters was Guru Lagima, whose dedication to spiritual transcendence led him to achieve something previously thought impossible for mortal beings. Through decades of meditation and the gradual release of all earthly attachments, Lagima learned to separate his physical form from the pull of gravity itself, achieving sustained flight without the aid of gliders or other devices. The Guru spent the final 40 years of his life in constant flight, his feet never again touching solid ground, as he devoted himself entirely to spiritual contemplation and the pursuit of ultimate freedom. Lagima's achievement became the stuff of legend among airbenders, representing the highest possible expression of their philosophical ideals. His teachings emphasized the necessity of letting go of all material desires and emotional attachments that bound individuals to the physical world. While few could achieve his level of transcendence, his example inspired generations of airbenders to pursue spiritual enlightenment as their highest goal, establishing patterns of thought and practice that would define air nomad culture for thousands of years. In the volcanic islands that would eventually become the Fire Nation, a different approach to elemental mastery emerged among the Sun Warriors, a civilization that had maintained its connection to ancient traditions despite the changing world around them. These people had preserved their understanding of firebending through their reverence for dragons, magnificent creatures whose mastery of flame exceeded anything achieved by human practitioners. The Sun Warriors viewed fire not as a tool of destruction, but as a source of life energy that connected all living things to the cosmic forces that governed existence. The Sun Warriors' approach to firebending emphasized harmony with the element's life-giving properties rather than its capacity for destruction. Their techniques drew power from the sun itself, channeling the star's energy through movements that reflected the rhythms of celestial motion and the cycles of growth and renewal that governed the natural world. This philosophy created a sustainable form of firebending that strengthened both practitioner and community, rather than consuming them in pursuit of ever greater power. However, not all inhabitants of the Fire Islands shared the Sun Warriors' enlightened approach to elemental mastery. As various tribal groups developed their own traditions and territorial ambitions, conflicts arose between those who viewed fire as a sacred gift and those who saw it primarily as a weapon of conquest. These disagreements eventually led to the rise of warlords who used their bending abilities to claim territory and subjugate rival communities, beginning patterns of aggressive expansion that would plague the Fire Islands for generations. The most notorious of these early warlords was Ta, whose brutal tactics and complete disregard for traditional values made him feared throughout the archipelago. Ta's forces swept across the islands like wildfire, destroying communities that resisted his authority and enslaving those who survived his conquests. When one village attempted to organize resistance against his tyranny, Ta responded by ordering the abduction of all children in the settlement, a crime so heinous that it shocked even his own followers and allies. The children taken during Ta's campaign were never seen again, their fate becoming one of the great mysteries and tragedies of early Fire Nation history. Their grieving mothers, consumed by sorrow and rage at the loss of their children, underwent a transformation that defied natural law. Their pain was so profound that it severed their connection to the physical world, turning them into dark spirits whose sole purpose became the pursuit of vengeance against those responsible for their suffering. These tormented spirits began targeting the children of Ta and other warlords, creating a reign of supernatural terror that gradually undermined the foundations of the conquest-based society these rulers had built. The cycle of violence and retribution that followed demonstrated the cosmic consequences of actions taken without regard for their moral implications, showing how cruelty and injustice could create imbalances that transcended the boundaries between physical and spiritual realms. Ta's regime eventually collapsed under the weight of both supernatural opposition and the internal contradictions of a society built entirely on violence and exploitation. Other warlords attempted to replicate his methods of territorial expansion, but none achieved his level of success, and most found their own ambitions similarly undermined by the spiritual forces they had unwittingly awakened through their cruel actions. From the ashes of these failed attempts at conquest emerged a different model of leadership, one that combined strength with wisdom and territorial unity with respect for traditional values. The individual who accomplished this transformation, whose name was lost to history, but whose legacy shaped an entire civilization, became the first Fire Lord by offering the various island communities something they had never experienced under warlord rule: peace, prosperity, and protection without oppression. This first Fire Lord's success came through his understanding that lasting power required more than military strength or the ability to instill fear in one's subjects. He recruited the Fire Sages, spiritual leaders who had maintained their connection to ancient wisdom throughout the period of warlord conflicts, incorporating their guidance into his system of governance. This decision created a form of leadership that balanced temporal authority with spiritual responsibility, establishing precedents that would influence Fire Nation culture for thousands of years. The unification of the Fire Islands under a single ruler marked the beginning of what would eventually become one of the world's most powerful and influential nations. However, this early Fire Nation differed dramatically from the militaristic empire that would later threaten global peace under Fire Lord Sozin and his descendants. The original Fire Nation emphasized cultural development, technological innovation, and spiritual growth rather than territorial expansion or domination over other peoples. Meanwhile, in the vast northern waters, communities of waterbenders were developing their own unique approaches to elemental mastery and social organization. These people learned their bending techniques through careful observation of the ocean's tides and the moon's influence on water in all its forms. Their philosophy emphasized adaptability, emotional balance, and the healing properties of water, creating a culture that valued cooperation and mutual support over individual achievement or competitive advantage. The northern waterbenders eventually established a large city called Agna Kela, whose architecture incorporated flowing water features and ice structures that could be reshaped according to changing needs and circumstances. This settlement became a center of learning, where waterbending techniques were refined and passed down through generations of masters who understood their element's connection to the cycles of life and death that governed all existence. However, not all waterbending communities agreed with the northern tribe's approach to governance and cultural development. As tensions arose within their coalition over questions of leadership, resource distribution, and spiritual practice, a significant faction chose to leave the North entirely rather than continue living under what they perceived as increasingly restrictive social structures. These separatists journeyed to the South Pole, where they established their own settlement based on different principles of organization and different interpretations of waterbending philosophy. The southern water tribe that emerged from this migration developed a more egalitarian social structure than their northern cousins, emphasizing individual freedom and personal responsibility rather than rigid hierarchies and centralized authority. Despite their political differences, the two tribes maintained friendly relations and regular communication, understanding that their shared heritage and common challenges created bonds stronger than their disagreements over governance. Both water tribes incorporated spiritual leaders known as water sages into their social structures. Though these figures served different roles than their counterparts in other nations, while fire sages became integrated into governmental hierarchies and earth sages evolved into political officials, water sages remained focused primarily on spiritual guidance and the preservation of traditional knowledge. This emphasis on spiritual rather than temporal authority reflected the waterbending philosophy's prioritization of wisdom and emotional balance over power and control. On the great continent that would eventually become the Earth Kingdom, a different pattern of development emerged as various earthbending communities established settlements that reflected their element's characteristics of permanence, stability, and gradual but inexorable growth. The most successful of these early settlements was Ba Sing Se, a walled city whose founders understood that protection and prosperity required both natural defenses and efficient internal organization. Ba Sing Se's growth from a small settlement to the largest city in the known world occurred gradually over many centuries as successive generations of earthbenders expanded its walls and developed increasingly sophisticated systems of governance, commerce, and defense. The city's architecture incorporated earthbending principles throughout its design, with structures that could be modified or expanded as circumstances required, while maintaining the solid foundations that ensured their permanence. The earthbending community also produced two legendary figures whose tragic love story became one of the founding myths of their culture. Oma and Shu were powerful earthbenders from rival villages whose peoples had been engaged in seemingly endless conflict over territory and resources. Despite the animosity between their communities, the two young people fell deeply in love and began meeting secretly in caves beneath the mountains that separated their settlements. During their clandestine meetings, Oma and Shu learned earthbending techniques from the badger moles, natural masters of the element whose tunneling abilities far exceeded anything achieved by human practitioners. These underground sessions allowed them to develop skills that surpassed those of any earthbender in either village, while their love for each other inspired them to dream of a world where such conflicts might be resolved through understanding rather than violence. When Shu was killed during one of the periodic battles between their villages, Oma's grief transformed into a force of earthbending power. Unlike anything previously witnessed, her emotional pain channeled itself through her connection to the element, creating seismic disturbances that ended the conflict by demonstrating the futility of continued violence. Under her leadership, the two communities merged into a single settlement that honored Shu's memory, while establishing new traditions based on cooperation rather than conquest. The city that grew from this union eventually became known as Omashu, its name commemorating the love that had made its existence possible, while serving as a reminder that even the deepest grief could be transformed into something constructive and life-affirming. The earthbending techniques developed by Oma and Shu in their underground sanctuary became fundamental to earthbending instruction throughout the growing Earth Kingdom, while their story inspired countless other earthbenders to pursue mastery through understanding rather than mere application of force. As earthbending communities spread across the great continent, some practitioners developed such profound connections to their element that they achieved recognition as earth sages, spiritual and intellectual leaders, whose wisdom extended far beyond mere bending techniques. These sages gradually assumed political responsibilities within their communities, creating a system of governance that combined earthbending mastery with administrative capability and moral authority. The integration of bending ability with political power created unique challenges and opportunities within Earth Kingdom society, as leaders were expected to demonstrate both elemental mastery and wisdom in governance. This system generally produced stable and effective leadership, though it occasionally resulted in conflicts when powerful earthbenders disagreed about policy directions or territorial boundaries. One of the most dramatic examples of such conflict involved a pair of conjoined twins named Hun-Dun, earthbenders whose shared body housed two distinct personalities with very different approaches to their elemental abilities and social responsibilities. While one twin sought to use their combined power for constructive purposes, the other became obsessed with chaos and destruction, eventually learning to harness chaotic energies that amplified their earthbending beyond normal limits. The twins' internal conflict eventually manifested as external violence when they used their enhanced abilities to attack communities throughout the Earth Kingdom. Their earthbending techniques, powered by chaotic forces that defied conventional understanding of elemental mastery. The devastation they caused threatened the stability of the entire region until an early Avatar incarnation intervened, defeating the twins in battle and banishing them to the spirit world, where their destructive impulses could no longer threaten mortal civilization. This confrontation between the Avatar and Hun-Dun established important precedents for how cosmic balance would be maintained in the developing world, demonstrating that even the most powerful earthbenders could be held accountable for their actions by forces that transcended normal political or military authority. The twins' banishment to the spirit world also created a supernatural threat that would persist for thousands of years, as their desire for revenge against the Avatar would eventually drive them to return during moments of cosmic vulnerability. Throughout this era of cultural development and national formation, the Avatar cycle continued its eternal progression as successive incarnations worked to maintain balance between the emerging powers and resolve conflicts that threatened global stability. Each Avatar brought unique perspectives and capabilities to their role, while carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of their predecessors, creating a continuity of purpose that transcended individual lifetimes or personal ambitions. The establishment of the Order of the White Lotus during this period reflected growing recognition that knowledge and wisdom should transcend national boundaries and political divisions. This secret society drew membership from all 4 developing nations, bringing together scholars, philosophers, and masters of various disciplines who shared a commitment to preserving important knowledge and protecting the Avatar when necessary. The White Lotus operated in secrecy, not because their goals were subversive, but because their international character might be viewed with suspicion by nationalist leaders who prioritized their own nation's interests over global cooperation. The organization's members understood that the challenges facing their developing world required wisdom and perspective that no single nation could provide, making their collaborative approach essential for long-term stability and progress. As the 4 nations gradually solidified their distinct identities and territorial boundaries, the stage was set for both cooperation and conflict on a scale that previous generations could never have imagined. The Avatar cycle would continue to evolve and adapt to these changing circumstances, facing new challenges that would test the fundamental principles established during Wan's first incarnation, while laying the groundwork for the epic struggles and triumphs that would define the ages to come. The transition from Wan's era to the age of organized nations brought with it new complexities that required avatars to develop skills far beyond mere elemental mastery. As the 4 nations solidified their distinct identities and began interacting on an increasingly sophisticated political stage, the Avatar's role evolved from that of a spiritual bridge between worlds to include the equally challenging responsibility of diplomatic mediator between peoples whose cultural differences often seemed irreconcilable. Several centuries before the events that would define the modern Avatar timeline, a Fire Nation child was born who would demonstrate how an Avatar's dedication to their homeland could both strengthen and compromise their effectiveness as a global peacekeeper. Avatar Seto entered the world during a period when the Fire Nation faced unprecedented internal crises that threatened to tear apart the very fabric of their civilization. Natural disasters ravaged the islands with increasing frequency, while deadly plagues swept through communities that lacked adequate defenses against such supernatural afflictions. The Fire Nation's political structure, which had maintained relative stability for generations through the careful balance of Fire Lord authority and Fire Sage wisdom, began to fracture under the pressure of these mounting catastrophes. Ancient noble clans that had previously accepted centralized rule started asserting their own territorial claims, viewing the Fire Lord's apparent inability to address the crisis as evidence of weakened legitimacy. Violence erupted between rival factions as each sought to position themselves as the true protectors of Fire Nation interests and values. Seto's identification as the Avatar came unusually early in his childhood, when he demonstrated the ability to bend a second element while still quite young. This early manifestation of Avatar abilities reflected the cosmic urgency of the situation facing his homeland, as though the Avatar spirit itself recognized that extraordinary measures would be required to preserve the Fire Nation from complete collapse. The Fire Sages, who confirmed his identity, understood that their nation's survival might depend on how quickly and effectively they could guide this young Avatar toward mastery of his abilities, rather than following the traditional path of traveling to other nations to learn the remaining elements. Seto made a decision that would define both his Avatar tenure and the philosophical debates surrounding his legacy. He chose to focus almost exclusively on his duties to the Fire Nation, viewing the immediate crisis facing his people as more pressing than the broader responsibilities typically associated with the Avatar role. This decision reflected a fundamental tension in Avatar philosophy between universal service and national loyalty that would resurface repeatedly throughout the cycle's history. Seto's approach to addressing the Fire Nation's crisis demonstrated remarkable political acumen combined with deep understanding of administrative and economic principles. Rather than relying solely on his Avatar powers to impose solutions, he chose to work within existing governmental structures, advancing through the bureaucratic hierarchy based on merit and proven capability, rather than demanding special treatment due to his cosmic status. This methodical approach earned him respect from Fire Nation officials who might otherwise have viewed Avatar intervention as foreign interference in domestic affairs. The young Avatar's talent for diplomacy, accounting, and strategic planning proved ideally suited to addressing the complex challenges facing his nation. He developed comprehensive policies that addressed not only the immediate symptoms of the crisis, but also the underlying economic and social factors that had made the Fire Nation vulnerable to such disruption. His reforms strengthened Fire Lord Yosor's authority while creating more efficient systems for resource distribution and disaster response. Seto's economic policies proved particularly innovative, establishing new taxation systems that more fairly distributed the burden of national recovery, while creating incentives for productive behavior that would strengthen the nation's long-term stability. His diplomatic skills helped resolve conflicts between noble clans by finding compromises that addressed their legitimate concerns while maintaining overall unity under Fire Lord authority. These achievements demonstrated how Avatar abilities could be channeled through conventional political channels to achieve results that pure spiritual power could never accomplish alone. The scope of Seto's success in rebuilding Fire Nation's strength and prosperity eventually earned him recognition as the individual who single-handedly prevented their civilization from collapsing entirely. Scholars and historians from his era credited him with saving not only the Fire Nation's political structures, but also their cultural identity and spiritual traditions. His reforms created foundations for stability and growth that would influence Fire Nation development for centuries to come. However, Seto's intense focus on Fire Nation affairs came at a significant cost to his effectiveness as a global avatar. His reluctance to travel extensively or involve himself deeply in the affairs of other nations meant that many international problems that might have benefited from Avatar intervention went unaddressed during his tenure. While he occasionally visited other nations for diplomatic purposes or to study at institutions like the Northern Air Temple and Wan Shi Tong's library, these trips were brief and focused on acquiring knowledge that could benefit the Fire Nation rather than building the broad international relationships typically expected of an avatar. The perception among international observers that Seto prioritized Fire Nation interests over universal balance created philosophical debates that would influence Avatar scholarship for generations. Critics argued that his regional focus violated fundamental principles of Avatar responsibility and created precedents that could justify future avatars neglecting their global duties in favor of national loyalty. Supporters countered that the existential threat facing the Fire Nation required extraordinary measures and that Seto's success in preserving an entire civilization demonstrated the highest form of Avatar service. These debates reflected deeper tensions within Avatar philosophy regarding the proper balance between cultural identity and universal responsibility. Seto's example suggested that avatars might sometimes face situations where their duties to their birth nation conflicted with their broader cosmic role, forcing them to make difficult choices about where to focus their limited time and energy. The complexity of these ethical questions would continue to challenge Avatar scholars and future incarnations throughout the cycle's history. Despite the controversies surrounding his approach, Seto's personal dedication to his responsibilities remained beyond question. Those who worked closely with him during his tenure described a leader who maintained rigorous standards for himself and others. Someone who approached his duties with unwavering commitment, regardless of personal cost. His public persona projected competence and reliability, qualities that helped restore confidence in Fire Nation institutions during their period of greatest vulnerability. Yet beneath this composed exterior, Seto struggled with personal challenges that he rarely revealed to those around him. The weight of responsibility for an entire nation's survival, combined with the knowledge that his choices affected millions of lives, created psychological pressures that no amount of Avatar training could fully prepare him to handle. His successors would later sense the emotional complexity that lay hidden beneath his reputation for administrative efficiency and political success. When Seto's time finally came to an end, his death marked the conclusion of an Avatar tenure that had successfully addressed immediate crises while raising fundamental questions about the nature of Avatar responsibility. His legacy lived on in the strengthened Fire Nation institutions he had created and the philosophical debates his approach had inspired. The Avatar spirit, carrying forward both his achievements and the unresolved tensions his choices had created, sought its next incarnation among the air nomads of the Western Air Temple. The child who would become Avatar Yangchen entered the world bearing gifts and burdens that set her apart from typical Avatar incarnations. From her earliest years, she experienced phenomena that marked her as extraordinary, even by Avatar standards. Voices spoke to her constantly, carrying fragments of memories and wisdom from past incarnations that her young mind struggled to process and understand. These spiritual communications, while ultimately beneficial to her development as an Avatar, initially manifested as painful episodes that resembled epileptic seizures. By the age of 8, Yangchen's condition had become so severe that these spiritual intrusions caused her to collapse into fits that left her temporarily incapacitated and in considerable physical pain. The air nomad healers and spiritual advisors who attended her understood that they were witnessing something unprecedented in Avatar history, though they lacked the knowledge needed to provide effective treatment for her unique condition. The realization that these episodes were actually manifestations of past Avatar memories emerging prematurely led to Yangchen's identification as the Avatar at an unusually young age. The early identification of Yangchen's Avatar status created both opportunities and challenges for her development. While it allowed her teachers to begin her training earlier than normal and provided context for understanding her unusual experiences, it also placed enormous pressure on a child who was already struggling with supernatural phenomena beyond her comprehension. The air nomad community that surrounded her responded with characteristic compassion and wisdom, creating supportive environments that helped her gradually learn to manage her unique gifts. During this same period, the political landscape of the Avatar world was undergoing dramatic changes that would define the context for Yangchen's eventual service. When she was 9 years old, a crisis erupted that threatened to destabilize relationships between the Fire Nation, Water Tribes, and Earth Kingdom in ways that could lead to prolonged international conflict. The incident that sparked this crisis became known as the Platinum Affair, a complex political situation that demonstrated how economic interests could override diplomatic considerations when national leaders felt their sovereignty was threatened. The origins of the Platinum Affair lay in the Earth Kingdom's internal political struggles, where an ambitious general had attempted to overthrow the established government through military force. This coup attempt might have remained a purely domestic matter, except for the discovery that both the Fire Nation and Water Tribes had secretly provided financial support to the rebellious general. The foreign powers had shipped bars of precious platinum to fund the general's armies and expenses, viewing his potential success as beneficial to their own strategic interests. When the Earth King's forces defeated the coup attempt and uncovered evidence of foreign intervention, the revelation created a diplomatic crisis that threatened to escalate into open warfare between the nations. The Earth King's response demonstrated both his political sophistication and his determination to assert his kingdom's independence from foreign manipulation. Rather than declaring war immediately, he chose a more calculated form of retaliation that would inflict long-term economic and political consequences on those who had interfered in his nation's affairs. The Earth King ordered the closure of most Earth Kingdom ports to Fire Nation and Water Tribe ships, effectively severing the trade relationships that had developed between these nations over many generations. To symbolize his resolve and the permanence of his decision, he had the captured platinum bars melted down and used to plate a statue in his throne room. The Earth King declared that trade relations would not resume until the platinum had rusted sufficiently to appear like ordinary stone, a process that could theoretically take hundreds of years under normal circumstances. This declaration sent shockwaves through the international community, as the economic implications of such prolonged isolation became apparent. The Fire Nation and Water Tribes, recognizing that they faced similar economic hardships if the Earth Kingdom maintained its position, responded by implementing their own policies of isolationism. What had begun as a localized political crisis rapidly evolved into a comprehensive breakdown of international cooperation that affected every aspect of international relations. The economic disruption caused by this mutual isolation created opportunities for certain groups who were positioned to profit from the situation. A small number of cities that remained open for limited trade became crucial bottlenecks through which all international commerce had to flow. The families who controlled these strategic locations, known collectively as the Shang merchant class, gradually accumulated enormous wealth and political influence as they exploited their monopolistic positions. The Shang's growing power was not merely economic, but also technological, as they employed some of the world's most innovative artisans and engineers to develop new methods for protecting and expanding their commercial operations. Among their most significant innovations was the development of combustion bending, a specialized form of fire bending that allowed practitioners to create targeted explosions at a distance. This deadly technique provided the Shangs with military capabilities that complemented their economic leverage, making them formidable opponents for anyone who might challenge their authority. The merchant family's ultimate ambition extended far beyond mere commercial success to encompass complete political independence from the nations that had originally granted them trading privileges. Their conspiracy, which they called the Unanimity Project, aimed to establish an autonomous state under Shang control that would be free from external interference or taxation. This goal required careful coordination between multiple merchant families and the gradual accumulation of military resources that could defend their independence if challenged by traditional national authorities. As Yang Chen matured and began to understand her role as Avatar, she encountered a world where the breakdown of international cooperation had created numerous localized conflicts and injustices that demanded her attention. The isolationist policies implemented by the major nations had not eliminated their problems, but had instead allowed smaller-scale abuses and conflicts to flourish without the oversight that more normal diplomatic relationships might have provided. The Avatar's traditional role as a mediator between nations became more complex when those nations refused to engage with each other through normal diplomatic channels. Yang Chen's approach to these challenges reflected both her air nomad upbringing and her unique spiritual gifts. Rather than attempting to force immediate solutions through Avatar power, she chose to develop sophisticated understanding of political and economic systems that would allow her to address root causes rather than merely treating symptoms. Her natural intelligence and spiritual insights proved ideally suited to the complex negotiations required to bridge differences between parties who had little inclination to compromise. One of Yang Chen's most significant early interventions involved her discovery of the suffering caused by Shang merchant practices in the city of Binan. Her visit to this trading center revealed the enormous disparities between the merchant family's luxury and the desperate poverty experienced by ordinary citizens who labored to generate the wealth that funded Shang political ambitions. The Avatar's attempts to implement reforms that would improve conditions for common people brought her into direct conflict with merchant interests that valued profit over human welfare. The Shang's response to Yang Chen's interference demonstrated both their ruthlessness and their military capabilities as they unleashed their combustion benders against Binan's population in a display of force designed to discourage further Avatar intervention. This attack represented a direct challenge to Avatar authority that could not be ignored without undermining the credibility of the entire institution. Yang Chen's successful capture and imprisonment of the combustion benders at the Northern Air Temple sent a clear message that Avatar power could overcome even the most advanced technological advantages when deployed with sufficient determination and skill. The aftermath of this confrontation established Yang Chen as the de facto administrator of several strategic trading cities, giving her direct political authority that complemented her spiritual responsibilities as Avatar. This unprecedented arrangement required her to develop new approaches to governance that balanced Avatar principles with practical administrative requirements. Her success in managing these complex responsibilities demonstrated how Avatar abilities could be channeled through political institutions to achieve results that pure spiritual intervention could never accomplish. Yang Chen's growing political influence allowed her to begin addressing the broader international tensions that had created the crisis in the first place. Through careful diplomacy, strategic pressure, and occasional displays of Avatar power, she gradually convinced the major nations to abandon their isolationist policies and return to more normal patterns of international cooperation. Her network of spies and administrative assistants, inherited from the Shang merchant operations she had displaced, provided her with intelligence and communication capabilities that enhanced her effectiveness as a diplomatic mediator. However, Yang Chen's success in resolving human political conflicts came at the cost of neglecting spiritual responsibilities that would create problems for her successors. Many of the agreements she negotiated between humans and spirits were expedient compromises designed to address immediate concerns rather than sustainable solutions that respected the long-term interests of both parties. Her focus on political stability and human welfare sometimes led her to make promises to spirits that she lacked the ability or intention to fulfill completely. The fragility of these spiritual agreements would become apparent only after Yang Chen's death, when the spirits she had negotiated with discovered that their human counterparts had little inclination to honor commitments made by a previous avatar. The breakdown of these treaties would create a legacy of spiritual conflict that would plague her immediate successor and demonstrate the interconnected nature of avatar responsibilities. Yang Chen's story illustrated both the potential and the limitations of political solutions to cosmic problems, showing how even the most skilled diplomatic interventions could create unintended consequences that transcended individual avatar lifetimes. The political changes Yang Chen implemented during her tenure created a more stable international system that benefited human civilization but failed to address underlying spiritual imbalances that would eventually demand attention. Her approach to avatar responsibilities prioritized immediate human welfare over long-term cosmic harmony, a choice that reflected both the urgency of the crises she faced and the inherent difficulty of balancing competing demands on avatar attention and energy. The wisdom gained through her experiences would become part of the accumulated knowledge available to future avatar incarnations, though the specific lessons of her tenure would prove relevant in ways that neither she nor her contemporaries could fully anticipate. The death of Avatar Yang Chen marked the end of an era defined by political sophistication and diplomatic innovation, yet it also revealed the profound costs of prioritizing immediate human concerns over long-term spiritual balance. As her spirit departed the mortal realm to join the eternal cycle of avatar reincarnation, the carefully constructed treaties and agreements that had maintained peace between humans and spirits began to unravel with alarming rapidity. The spirits who had reluctantly accepted Yang Chen's compromises discovered that their human counterparts lacked both the inclination and the authority to honor commitments made by a previous avatar, leading to a cascade of broken promises that would poison relationships between the two worlds for generations. Into this deteriorating situation was born Avatar Karuk of the Northern Water Tribe, a child whose early years seemed to promise a very different approach to avatar responsibilities than his predecessor had demonstrated. Where Yang Chen had been studious and politically minded from childhood, Karuk displayed a carefree attitude that initially frustrated his teachers and concerned the water sages responsible for his education. His natural talents were undeniable, but his apparent lack of seriousness about his cosmic responsibilities created doubts about his suitability for the avatar role. The young Karuk's behavior reflected not irresponsibility, but rather a fundamental difference in personality that would shape his entire approach to avatar duties. While Yang Chen had thrived on the intellectual challenges of political negotiation and administrative management, Karuk found fulfillment in physical pursuits and direct action rather than careful planning and diplomatic subtlety. His teachers gradually learned to channel these natural inclinations toward productive ends, though they never fully understood the deeper currents of determination that lay beneath his seemingly casual exterior. During his elemental training, Kuruk demonstrated remarkable natural ability, combined with an unfortunate tendency toward impulsiveness that occasionally created spectacular disasters. The most notable of these incidents occurred while he was learning to master the Avatar state, when his inexperience and emotional volatility caused him to accidentally destroy an entire uninhabited island in the Mose Sea. This catastrophic display of uncontrolled power served as a sobering reminder of the destructive potential that lay dormant within every avatar, waiting to be unleashed by careless application of cosmic forces. The destruction of the island marked a turning point in Kuruk's training as he began to understand the true magnitude of the power he wielded and the care required to use it responsibly. His teachers intensified their efforts to instill discipline and self-control, while Kuruk himself developed a more serious appreciation for the consequences of his actions. This period of intensive training also introduced him to 3 individuals who would become his closest friends and most trusted advisors throughout his Avatar tenure. Jianju, an earthbender of exceptional skill and intelligence, brought strategic thinking and political acumen that complemented Kuruk's more intuitive approach to problem solving. Kelsang, an airbender whose wisdom and spiritual insight reflected the best traditions of air nomad philosophy, provided guidance on matters requiring careful consideration and moral reflection. Hei Ran, a firebender whose mastery of her element was matched only by her fierce loyalty and unwavering principles, offered both tactical expertise and the kind of honest counsel that true friendship demanded. These 4 companions formed a team whose combined abilities and diverse perspectives made them extraordinarily effective at addressing the complex challenges that defined Kuruk's era. Their friendship transcended the political boundaries that often complicated international cooperation, demonstrating how personal bonds could bridge cultural differences and create understanding that formal diplomacy could never achieve. For Kuruk personally, these relationships provided emotional anchors that helped stabilize his sometimes volatile personality, while offering the support he needed to bear the enormous psychological burden of Avatar responsibilities. However, beneath the surface of this apparently successful partnership lay emotional complexities that Kuruk could never fully resolve. His feelings for Hei Ran extended far beyond friendship or professional respect, encompassing a deep romantic love that he never found the courage to express openly. The social conventions of their time, combined with the practical complications of his Avatar duties and her own career ambitions, created barriers that seemed insurmountable despite the obvious connection between them. Kuruk's unspoken love for Hei Ran became a source of both inspiration and torment throughout his life, driving him to achieve great things while simultaneously creating an emotional vulnerability that he struggled to manage. His inability to express these feelings or move beyond them affected every aspect of his Avatar service, creating a restlessness and dissatisfaction that no amount of professional success could completely address. The complexity of this situation reflected the broader challenges that avatars faced in balancing their cosmic responsibilities with their human needs for connection and emotional fulfillment. As Kuruk began his active service as Avatar, he encountered a world where the spiritual agreements negotiated by Yang Chen were collapsing with increasing frequency and devastating consequences. Spirits who had trusted in human promises found themselves betrayed and abandoned, their anger transforming them into dark entities whose corruption spread like a plague throughout the spirit world. These transformed spirits posed threats that transcended normal human understanding, requiring intervention that went far beyond conventional diplomatic or military solutions. The emergence of dark spirits created a crisis that played to Kuruk's strengths while simultaneously exposing his greatest weaknesses as an avatar. His natural inclination toward direct action and physical confrontation made him ideally suited to tracking down and battling these supernatural threats, but his preference for immediate solutions over long-term planning meant that he often addressed symptoms rather than underlying causes. Each victory against a dark spirit was temporary and costly, requiring enormous expenditures of spiritual energy that gradually undermined his physical health and mental stability. The toll of these spiritual battles manifested in ways that remained largely hidden from those around Kuruk, creating a devastating cycle of isolation and deterioration that he felt unable to break. The damage inflicted by dark spirits operated on levels that transcended physical injury, attacking the very essence of his being in ways that conventional healing could not address. His spiritual vitality slowly drained away with each confrontation, leaving him progressively weaker and more vulnerable to the psychological effects of prolonged exposure to supernatural corruption. Only one person understood the true nature of Kuruk's struggle and the enormous personal cost of his seemingly effortless victories against dark spirits. Nyahitha, a fire sage whose spiritual insights allowed him to perceive the hidden damage that Kuruk's battles inflicted, became the Avatar's confidant and healer during this difficult period. Despite Nyahitha's best efforts to treat both the physical and spiritual wounds that accumulated with each confrontation, Kuruk's condition continued to deteriorate as he stubbornly refused to moderate his approach to spirit combat. The secrecy that surrounded Kuruk's spiritual battles created a tragic irony that would haunt his legacy for generations. While he sacrificed his health and happiness to protect the world from supernatural threats that most people never knew existed, his public image became that of an irresponsible and hedonistic avatar who neglected his duties in favor of personal pleasure. His friends and companions, unaware of his hidden struggles, gradually lost patience with what they perceived as increasingly erratic and self-destructive behavior. This misunderstanding reached its most painful point when Heiran, the woman Kuruk loved but had never been able to approach, found love with another and chose to marry outside their circle of friends. The news of her engagement struck Kuruk with devastating force, destroying his last hope for personal happiness while confirming his growing belief that his avatar duties had isolated him from normal human connections. The emotional trauma of this loss drove him to even more reckless confrontations with dark spirits as he sought to lose himself in combat rather than face the emptiness that seemed to define his personal life. During one such mission, Kuruk tracked down Father Glowworm, a particularly powerful dark spirit whose activities had created dangerous instabilities between the physical and spirit worlds. This entity possessed abilities that far exceeded those of the corrupted spirits Kuruk had previously encountered, representing a threat that demanded the full extent of Avatar power to address effectively. The battle between them proved to be one of the most challenging confrontations in Avatar history, testing both combatants to their absolute limits. The fight against Father Glowworm demonstrated both Kuruk's exceptional combat abilities and the terrible price of his long campaign against Dark Spirit. Though he ultimately succeeded in wounding the entity severely enough to drive it into temporary retreat, the victory came at enormous personal cost. Father Glowworm's final act before fleeing was to place a curse upon the Avatar, a supernatural affliction that would affect not only Kuruk, but potentially future incarnations of the Avatar spirit. The curse represented more than mere vindictiveness on Father Glowworm's part, embodying a fundamental corruption of the cosmic balance that avatars were meant to maintain. This supernatural taint would lie dormant within the avatar cycle for generations, waiting for moments of vulnerability to manifest its destructive influence. Kuruk's acceptance of this burden reflected his understanding that protecting the world sometimes required sacrifices that transcended individual lifetimes, though he could not have anticipated the specific ways in which his choice would affect his successors. The physical and spiritual damage inflicted during the Father Glowworm encounter left Kuruk permanently weakened, though he continued his self-destructive pattern of seeking out dangerous opponents rather than focusing on recovery and healing. His deteriorating condition became increasingly difficult to hide from those around him. Yet, he persisted in maintaining the facade of casual indifference that had become his trademark. This stubborn refusal to acknowledge his limitations or seek help reflected both his pride and his deep-seated belief that his suffering was a necessary part of his avatar duties. The trajectory of Kuruk's decline might have continued indefinitely if not for an encounter that briefly restored his capacity for hope and joy. Ummi, a young woman whose beauty and intelligence captivated him completely, represented everything he had thought lost to him. Through his avatar responsibilities, their meeting occurred during a period when Kuruk had temporarily stepped back from active spirit hunting, creating space for personal relationships that his previous obsessions had precluded. The love that blossomed between Kuruk and Ummi offered him a glimpse of the life he might have lived if circumstances had been different. A future where personal happiness and avatar duties could coexist in harmonious balance. Their relationship developed with an intensity that reflected not only genuine affection, but also Kuruk's desperate hunger for normal human connection after years of isolation and hidden struggles. Ummi's presence in his life provided motivation for healing and recovery that no amount of external pressure had been able to inspire. Their decision to marry represented Kuruk's commitment to building a new life that would integrate his avatar responsibilities with his personal needs in ways he had never previously attempted. The wedding ceremony itself symbolized hope for a future where the pattern of sacrifice and isolation that had defined his tenure might finally be broken. For the first time in years, Kuruk allowed himself to believe that happiness was possible even for someone bearing the cosmic burden of Avatar duties. The tragedy that destroyed this newfound hope struck with cruel precision at the moment of their greatest joy, as though fate itself conspired to deny Kuruk any respite from suffering. As the wedding ceremony reached its climactic moment, Ummi was suddenly pulled into the spirit world by Ko the Face Stealer, an ancient and malevolent entity whose appearance represented the culmination of all the spiritual conflicts that had defined Kuruk's avatar service. The timing of this attack was not coincidental, but rather represented Ko's calculated revenge against the Avatar, who had interfered with so many dark spirit activities. Ko's theft of Ummi represented more than mere kidnapping, as the Face Stealer's particular form of predation involved stripping away not only physical features, but also the essential identity that made each person unique. The woman Kuruk loved was transformed into a blank, featureless shell whose mind retained awareness of her condition but possessed no means of expressing her continuing existence to the outside world. This fate was deliberately chosen to maximize Kuruk's psychological torment, offering him the possibility of rescue while making actual success virtually impossible. The desperate attempts that followed to recover Ummi from Ko's realm pushed Kuruk beyond all reasonable limits, as he employed every resource at his disposal to penetrate the spirit world's deepest mysteries. His efforts to navigate the supernatural landscape where Ko dwelled required him to master techniques and knowledge that few avatars had ever attempted, expanding his spiritual abilities while simultaneously exposing him to dangers that accelerated his physical deterioration. Each failed rescue attempt left him weaker and more desperate. Yet he could not abandon the hope that sufficient determination might eventually succeed where previous efforts had failed. The futility of these rescue missions gradually became apparent as Kuruk learned more about Ko's nature and the irreversible character of the Face Stealer's predation. The ancient spirit's power derived from emotions and reactions that Kuruk could not avoid feeling, making every encounter a trap that strengthened his enemy while weakening his own position. The knowledge that his very love for Ummi made her rescue more difficult created a psychological burden that no amount of avatar training had prepared him to bear. The accumulation of spiritual damage, emotional trauma, and physical exhaustion from years of hidden battles finally overwhelmed even Kuruk's extraordinary constitution. In the year 312 before the air nomad genocide, his death came not from any single catastrophic event, but from the gradual collapse of systems that had been strained beyond their capacity to function. At the age of 33, an avatar who had sacrificed everything to protect the world from threats it never knew existed, finally succumbed to the accumulated cost of his service. Kuruk's final moments were spent with the friends who had supported him throughout his troubled tenure, though even then he could not fully explain the hidden struggles that had shaped his choices and defined his legacy. His last instructions to Jianju, Kelsung, and Hei Ran reflected his understanding that future avatars would need better guidance and support than he had received, though his specific recommendations would prove difficult to implement given the misunderstandings that surrounded his public reputation. The legacy that Kuruk left behind was complex and often contradictory, reflecting the gap between his public image and his hidden sacrifices. While many viewed him as a failed avatar who had neglected his duties in favor of personal indulgence, those who understood his true service recognized him as someone who had given everything to protect the world from supernatural threats that transcended normal human comprehension. His story would serve as both warning and inspiration for future avatars, demonstrating both the dangers of isolation and the courage required to face impossible challenges. The spiritual imbalances that had driven Kuruk to such desperate measures remained unresolved at the time of his death, creating a legacy of problems that would challenge his successor in ways that no previous avatar had been forced to confront. The breakdown of human-spirit relations, the emergence of organized criminal groups, and the political instabilities that had festered during his tenure would all demand attention from an avatar who would approach these challenges with very different methods and philosophical assumptions. As the avatar spirit prepared to seek its next incarnation, it carried forward both the wisdom gained through Kuruk's experiences and the unresolved conflicts that his sacrifice had temporarily contained. The child who would become Avatar Kyoshi would inherit not only the accumulated knowledge of all previous avatars, but also the specific burden of problems that required solutions beyond anything her predecessors had attempted. The stage was set for an avatar whose approach to cosmic balance would prove as controversial as it was effective, reshaping the fundamental assumptions about what methods were acceptable in service of ultimate justice. The death of Avatar Kuruk in 312 before the Air Nomad genocide created a spiritual vacuum that would profoundly shape the world into which his successor was born. The same year that witnessed Kuruk's passing also marked the arrival of a daughter to Jesa and Hark, two members of the Flying Opera Company, whose lives as traveling performers and occasional thieves had taken them far from conventional paths of parenthood and responsibility. Their child, born in humble circumstances that offered no hint of her cosmic destiny, would grow up to become Avatar Kyoshi, whose approach to justice and balance would challenge every assumption about how Avatar power should be wielded. The Flying Opera Company that gave Kyoshi her earliest experiences of community represented a unique subculture that existed on the margins of Earth Kingdom society. These traveling performers combined legitimate entertainment with carefully planned criminal activities, using their artistic skills as cover for operations that redistributed wealth from corrupt officials and greedy merchants to those who struggled to survive under oppressive economic conditions. Their philosophy blended theatrical flair with pragmatic morality, creating a worldview that would profoundly influence Kyoshi's later understanding of justice and the sometimes necessary relationship between righteous ends and questionable means. Jessa and Hark's decision to leave their infant daughter in the care of Yokoya village reflected both the practical realities of their nomadic lifestyle and their genuine belief that a stable community could provide better opportunities than life on the road with a criminal troupe. However, their choice also demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of village social dynamics and the harsh treatment often accorded to children without clear family connections or economic value. The villagers who initially accepted responsibility for Kyoshi's care gradually lost interest in her welfare as the years passed without any return from her parents or compensation for her upkeep. By the time Kyoshi reached her 6th year, the casual neglect that had characterized her early childhood had evolved into active abandonment as the villagers of Yokoya concluded that her parents would never return to claim her or provide support for her continued care. The community's decision to cast out a child reflected both the harsh economic realities of rural Earth Kingdom life and the moral callousness that often accompanied desperate struggles for survival. Kyoshi found herself homeless and largely friendless, forced to develop resourcefulness and resilience that would serve her throughout her life, while also creating emotional scars that would influence her approach to power and justice. The years of hunger, isolation, and social rejection that defined Kyoshi's childhood created a young woman whose understanding of the world was shaped by direct experience of its cruelties and inequities. Unlike previous avatars who had grown up in privileged circumstances or supportive communities, Kyoshi learned about injustice not through abstract philosophy, but through daily encounters with systems that valued wealth and status over human worth. Her early experiences taught her that survival often required making difficult choices, and that those with power rarely used it to protect the vulnerable, unless forced to do so through superior strength or compelling consequences. During this period of abandonment and struggle, 2 figures appeared in Yokoya who would eventually reshape Kyoshi's destiny. Though their initial encounter offered no hint of the cosmic significance that would later unfold, Jianju and Kelsang, former companions of Avatar Kuruk, who had dedicated themselves to finding and training his successor, arrived in the village as part of their systematic search for the new Avatar. Their mission had taken them across the Earth Kingdom as they investigated children who demonstrated unusual abilities or other signs that might indicate Avatar status. The Earthbender and Airbender's initial meeting with the young Kyoshi revealed a girl whose circumstances had forced her to develop survival skills and street wisdom far beyond her years, but who showed no obvious signs of the elemental mastery they expected from an Avatar candidate. Kelsang's compassionate nature was immediately moved by her obvious need and abandonment, leading him to provide food and basic care during their brief stay in Yokoya. However, Kyoshi's deep-seated mistrust of adults who offered help without clear motives caused her to flee before they could learn more about her background or abilities. The departure of these potential benefactors left Kyoshi once again alone and struggling to survive. Though their brief kindness had planted seeds of possibility that would eventually grow into something transformative. Their continued search for Kuruk's successor would eventually lead them back into her life under very different circumstances, when the true nature of her cosmic role would finally be revealed through events that none of them could have anticipated during their first encounter. Meanwhile, across the Earth Kingdom, the political instabilities that had festered during Kuruk's final years were beginning to manifest as open conflicts that threatened the established order. Jianju's confrontation with the Yellowneck rebels demonstrated both his formidable earthbending abilities and his willingness to employ brutal methods when dealing with those who challenged legitimate authority. His decision to bury 5,000 rebels alive reflected a pragmatic calculation that overwhelming force would prevent further bloodshed by discouraging additional uprisings, though the moral implications of such actions would later create complications for those associated with his methods. The defeat of the Yellownecks eliminated one source of instability while creating others, as surviving rebels went underground and their imprisoned leader, Shu Ping-an, became a symbol of resistance, whose eventual escape would pose new threats to Earth Kingdom security. The systematic study of Shu Ping-an's lightning generation abilities by Fire Nation researchers represented the kind of technological advancement through human experimentation that reflected the moral compromises often made by those in power when pursuing knowledge that might provide strategic advantages. Kelsang's successful campaign against the Fifth Nation pirates demonstrated a very different approach to conflict resolution, one that emphasized decisive action, tempered by mercy, and focused on protecting innocent victims rather than punishing enemies. His defeat of the pirate fleets eliminated a major threat to Earth Kingdom coastal communities, while avoiding the kind of wholesale slaughter that had characterized Jianzhu's approach to the Yellowneck Rebellion. The survival of Tagaka and her remaining followers created ongoing security concerns, but also preserved possibilities for future negotiation and peaceful resolution that total victory through annihilation would have precluded. The war of secrets and daggers that erupted within the Earth Kingdom royal family represented a more insidious threat to stability than either popular rebellion or external piracy. The practice of hiring assassins to eliminate political rivals reflected a corruption of traditional Earth Kingdom values that prioritize strength and endurance over cunning and deception. These internal conflicts weakened the kingdom's ability to address external threats, while creating opportunities for ambitious individuals to advance their own interests at the expense of legitimate authority and public welfare. During this period of mounting chaos and institutional breakdown, Jianzhu and Kelsang finally identified what they believed to be Avatar Kuruk's successor in the person of Yun, a 14-year-old earthbender whose abilities and strategic thinking seemed to fulfill their expectations for the new avatar. Yun's mastery of Pai Shou, using techniques associated with Kuruk, provided circumstantial evidence that supported their conclusion, while his natural charisma and quick intelligence suggested that he possessed the personal qualities necessary for effective avatar leadership. The decision to establish Yun's training in a mansion on the Yokoya Peninsula brought the supposed avatar into close proximity with Kyoshi, though neither initially understood the cosmic significance of their connection. Kelsang's compassionate decision to adopt Kyoshi and bring her into their household as Yun's bodyguard and servant reflected his genuine concern for her welfare, while also placing her in a position where her true nature would eventually be revealed through circumstances that no one could have anticipated. The relationship that developed between Yun and Kyoshi during his avatar training demonstrated both the genuine friendship possible between individuals from very different social backgrounds and the complex emotions that arise when personal bonds intersect with cosmic responsibilities. Yoon's natural kindness and Kyoshi's fierce loyalty created a connection that transcended their supposed differences in status and destiny, though the ultimate revelation of her true identity would transform this friendship into something far more complicated and ultimately tragic. Yoon's struggles with accessing additional elements beyond his native earthbending created growing concerns among his teachers about whether their identification had been correct. Though his exceptional diplomatic and leadership abilities seemed to compensate for this apparent limitation, his perfect performance in political and strategic situations suggested that he possessed the intellectual and emotional qualities necessary for Avatar service, even if his elemental mastery remained incomplete. The tension between these contradictory indicators would eventually lead to desperate measures that revealed both the truth about Kyoshi's identity and the terrible consequences of cosmic misunderstanding. The diplomatic mission to negotiate with the Fifth Nation pirates provided the first clear indication that something fundamental was wrong with the supposed Avatar identification, as Yun's inability to resolve the crisis through normal Avatar methods created a situation that required extraordinary intervention. Kyoshi's spontaneous entry into the Avatar state during the confrontation with Tagaka demonstrated both her true cosmic nature and the enormous power that lay dormant within her, waiting for moments of extreme necessity to manifest itself. The destruction that accompanied Kyoshi's first Avatar state experience exceeded anything that previous incarnations had achieved during their initial manifestations, suggesting that her particular connection to the Avatar spirit possessed unusual intensity and destructive potential. The devastation of much of the Fifth Nation base created immediate security for the diplomatic mission, while also establishing Kyoshi's reputation as an Avatar whose methods would emphasize decisive action over careful negotiation. The aftermath of this revelation forced Jeonju and Kelsang to confront the reality that their years of training and preparation had been based on a fundamental error that had profound implications for both Yoon and Kyoshi. The Earthbender's pragmatic response to this crisis reflected his understanding that cosmic mistakes required cosmic solutions, even when such solutions violated moral principles that would normally govern his behavior. His decision to consult Father Glowworm about the true Avatar's identity demonstrated both his commitment to discovering the truth and his willingness to employ dangerous methods when conventional approaches proved inadequate. The encounter with Father Glowworm revealed not only Kyoshi's true nature, but also the continuing influence of Kuruk's battles against dark spirits. As the entity's curse and corruption had grown stronger during the years since their last confrontation, Jeonju's sacrifice of Yoon to gain the information he sought represented a calculated decision that the needs of cosmic balance justified abandoning an individual who had been wrongly prepared for responsibilities that were never truly his to bear. The horror of witnessing Jeonju's betrayal and Yun's apparent death shattered Kyoshi's remaining trust in adult authority, while simultaneously awakening her to the true scope of her cosmic responsibilities. Her rejection of Jeonju as a teacher reflected both moral revulsion at his methods and practical understanding that someone capable of such betrayal could never be trusted with Avatar training. The conflict that erupted between Jianzhu and Kelsang over the ethics of their approach to Avatar service created divisions that would ultimately lead to tragedy for all involved. Kelsang's death during his confrontation with Jianzhu over the treatment of Yun eliminated Kyoshi's most trusted protector, while also depriving her of the one teacher whose methods aligned with her own moral sensibilities. The Airbender's sacrifice to enable Kyoshi and Rangi's escape demonstrated the kind of principled commitment to Avatar service that transcended personal safety or convenience, providing a model for dedication that would influence Kyoshi's understanding of what Avatar duty truly required. The period that followed Kyoshi's flight from Jianzhu's control became a transformative journey during which she began to understand both her cosmic role and her personal moral code through encounters with individuals whose wisdom transcended conventional social boundaries. Her reunion with the Flying Opera Company provided not only emotional support, but also practical education and survival skills, and unconventional approaches to justice that formal Avatar training would never have included. The revelation that Lao Ge, one of the opera company's apparently ordinary members, was actually the immortal assassin, Tia Guai, represented a turning point in Kyoshi's education as she encountered someone whose understanding of power and justice had been refined through centuries of experience. Tia Guai's teachings about life extension, strategic thinking, and the sometimes necessary relationship between violence and justice provided Kyoshi with philosophical frameworks that would shape her approach to Avatar service throughout her exceptionally long life. The decision to free Xu Ping An from prison demonstrated the opera company's commitment to their criminal activities, while also creating a situation that would test Kyoshi's emerging understanding of Avatar responsibilities. The confrontation that followed Xu Ping An's liberation forced Kyoshi to make her first deliberate choice to take a human life, as she concluded that the former Yellowneck leader's plans for renewed terrorism made his continued existence incompatible with public safety and cosmic balance. Kyoshi's killing of Xu Ping An in single combat marked her definitive break from traditional Avatar approaches to conflict resolution, establishing precedents for the use of lethal force that would characterize her entire tenure. This decision reflected both her practical understanding that some problems could only be solved through permanent elimination of threats, and her emotional commitment to protecting innocent people from those who would harm them for personal or political gain. The aftermath of this confrontation brought Kyoshi into conflict with Jianzhu once again, as the Earthbender's poisoning of the Council of Earth Sages demonstrated his increasingly desperate efforts to maintain control over Avatar affairs, despite his complete loss of moral authority. The mutual hostility that had developed between former allies created a situation where cooperation had become impossible, setting the stage for a final confrontation that would resolve the question of who possessed legitimate authority over Avatar training and cosmic responsibilities. The emergence of Yun from the spirit world, transformed by his merger with Father Glowworm, and driven by understandable rage at his betrayal, added a supernatural dimension to the political conflicts that had defined this period of Avatar history. His return as a corrupted but still sympathetic figure created moral complexities that challenged everyone involved, as his legitimate grievances were coupled with abilities and motivations that made him extraordinarily dangerous to both his former friends and innocent bystanders. The three-way confrontation between Kyoshi, Jianzhu, and the transformed Yoon in the tea house at Chameleon Bay brought together all the unresolved conflicts and betrayals that had shaped the early years of Kyoshi's Avatar service. Yoon's execution of Jianzhu provided a form of cosmic justice that Kyoshi might have been reluctant to impose herself, while also eliminating a source of ongoing threat and moral corruption that had poisoned Avatar training and Earth Kingdom politics. However, Yoon's continued existence as a supernatural entity driven by justified anger created ongoing problems that required Kyoshi to confront the most difficult aspect of Avatar responsibility: the necessity of sometimes destroying those whose suffering had been caused by the same systems and individuals that the Avatar was meant to protect. The tragic confrontation that ultimately led to Yoon's final death represented Kyoshi's acceptance that cosmic balance sometimes required her to become an instrument of destruction rather than preservation, a lesson that would shape her approach to justice throughout her extended life. The establishment of Kyoshi as a fully realized Avatar marked the beginning of a new era in cosmic balance, one characterized by decisive action, moral clarity, and the willingness to employ whatever methods, circumstances required to protect the innocent and maintain order. Her relationship with Rangi provided emotional stability and personal happiness that helped balance the psychological costs of her responsibilities, while her formation of the Kyoshi warriors created a legacy of principled strength that would influence Earth Kingdom culture for generations to come. The political reforms and security measures that Kyoshi implemented during her tenure reflected both her practical understanding of power dynamics and her commitment to creating systems that could function effectively even after her eventual departure from the mortal world. Her extended lifespan allowed her to personally oversee the implementation of these changes, while also providing stability during a period of significant social and political transformation that might otherwise have descended into chaos. As Kyoshi's extraordinary life drew toward its close, the world she left behind bore the unmistakable imprint of her particular approach to Avatar service. The institutions she had created, the precedents she had established, and the philosophical frameworks she had developed would influence her successors, even as they faced new challenges that required different methods and different forms of wisdom. The Avatar cycle continued its eternal progression, carrying forward both her achievements and the unresolved questions that her legacy had created for future generations to address. The death of Avatar Kyoshi in 82, before the Air Nomad genocide, marked the end of an era defined by decisive action and uncompromising moral clarity, leaving behind a world forever changed by her particular approach to cosmic balance and earthly justice. Her passing created both opportunity and uncertainty, as the Avatar spirit sought its next incarnation among the Fire Nation nobility, eventually selecting a child whose circumstances and temperament would prove dramatically different from those of his formidable predecessor. Avatar Roku entered the world as part of a twin birth to one of the Fire Nation's most prestigious families. His arrival, accompanied by that of his brother Yasu, in a cosmic coincidence that seemed to promise shared destiny and mutual support throughout their lives. The same day that witnessed Roku's birth also saw the arrival of Prince Sozin, heir to the Fire Nation throne, and destined to become one of the most significant figures in Avatar history. The synchronicity of their births created an immediate bond between the families that would shape both boys' early development and establish patterns of friendship that seemed to transcend the normal boundaries between royal and noble households. Their childhood friendship developed naturally through shared experiences, mutual respect, and complementary personalities that allowed each to bring out the best qualities in the other during their formative years. Roku's early life unfolded in circumstances of privilege and security that contrasted sharply with the hardships that had defined Kyoshi's youth. Yet, his noble upbringing also created expectations and responsibilities that would influence his approach to Avatar duties throughout his tenure. The Fire Nation society into which he was born emphasized honor, loyalty, and service to one's community and nation, values that would shape his understanding of how Avatar power should be wielded and what purposes it should serve. His family's position within the nobility provided him with education and opportunities that prepared him for leadership, while also instilling deep appreciation for Fire Nation culture and traditions. The relationship between Roku and his twin brother Yasu represented one of the most important emotional anchors in his early life, creating bonds of affection and mutual understanding that helped stabilize his personality during the challenging period of Avatar training and self-discovery. Yasu's presence provided Roku with perspective and companionship that allowed him to maintain connection to normal human relationships, even as his cosmic responsibilities began to separate him from conventional social patterns. Their shared experiences and inside jokes created a foundation of emotional security that would prove crucial during the more difficult aspects of Roku's Avatar development. Similarly, Roku's friendship with Prince Sozin offered him insight into the responsibilities and pressures associated with political leadership, while providing Sozin with exposure to perspectives that transcended purely national interests. Their relationship demonstrated how personal bonds could bridge different types of authority and responsibility, creating understanding between temporal and spiritual forms of power that might otherwise have remained separate and potentially conflicting. The genuine affection between them reflected their shared commitment to serving their people and their world, though their different roles would eventually create tensions that neither could fully anticipate during their carefree youth. Roku's discovery of a dragon egg during his childhood represented both extraordinary good fortune and symbolic foreshadowing of the deep connection to elemental forces that would characterize his Avatar service. The dragon that hatched from this egg, whom he named Fang, became not merely a companion but a spiritual partner whose wisdom and power complemented Roku's own developing abilities. Their relationship embodied the harmonious partnership between human and dragon that had characterized the most enlightened periods of Fire Nation history, demonstrating how mutual respect and understanding could create bonds that transcended species boundaries. The years of Roku's youth unfolded during a period of relative international stability that allowed the four nations to develop their cultures and economies without the pressures of major conflicts or existential threats. The isolationist policies that had characterized previous eras gradually gave way to more open approaches to cultural exchange and diplomatic cooperation, creating opportunities for learning and growth that benefited all nations. Air nomad teachings gained popularity among Fire Nation nobility, who appreciated their emphasis on spiritual development and intellectual pursuit, while technological innovations spread between nations through increased trade and communication. However, beneath this surface tranquility, tensions were beginning to develop that would eventually challenge the established international order and test Avatar authority in ways that previous incarnations had never experienced. The Fire Nation's growing technological capabilities, particularly in shipbuilding and metallurgy, created new possibilities for territorial expansion and resource acquisition that some leaders viewed as opportunities rather than responsibilities. The development of coal-powered vessels and advanced manufacturing techniques gave the Fire Nation advantages that could be used for either peaceful cooperation or aggressive expansion, depending on the wisdom and restraint of those who controlled such capabilities. The tragic death of Yasu in a sailing accident during Roku's 70th year before the genocide created the first major emotional trauma of his life, while also eliminating one of his most important sources of personal stability and perspective. The loss of his twin brother forced Roku to confront mortality and the fragility of human connections in ways that his privileged upbringing had not prepared him to handle. The grief and sense of incompleteness that followed Yasu's death would influence Roku's approach to relationships and responsibilities throughout the remainder of his life, creating both greater appreciation for those he loved and increased determination to protect others from similar losses. Roku's formal identification as the Avatar on his 16th birthday fulfilled expectations that had been building throughout his childhood, while also marking the beginning of a new phase of his life, characterized by intensive training and expanding responsibilities. The ceremony that announced his cosmic role was attended by Prince Sozin, whose genuine excitement and support for his friend's destiny demonstrated the strength of their bond, while also revealing Sozin's early fascination with Avatar power and its potential applications. The prince's enthusiasm for Roku's new status seemed to suggest that their friendship would continue to flourish despite the different paths their lives would now take. The beginning of Roku's Avatar training required him to leave the familiar environment of the Fire Nation and immerse himself in the very different cultural contexts that shaped the other nations' approaches to elemental mastery and spiritual development. His first destination was the Southern Air Temple, where he would study under Monk Gyatso and learn the philosophical principles that governed airbending, while also beginning to understand how his Fire Nation upbringing might need to be balanced with broader perspectives on cosmic responsibility and international cooperation. During his time at the Southern Air Temple, Roku formed a friendship with a young airbender named Gyatso, whose wisdom and compassion would influence his understanding of avatar duties throughout his life. Gyatso's approach to spiritual development emphasized the interconnectedness of all living things and the importance of maintaining harmony between different perspectives and approaches to existence. These teachings provided Roku with frameworks for understanding his role as a bridge between nations, while also helping him develop the emotional detachment necessary to make difficult decisions that served broader cosmic interests rather than personal or national preferences. The incident on Lambak Island during Roku's training period created the first significant test of his developing avatar abilities, while also revealing concerning aspects of Sozin's character that would prove prophetic of future conflicts. The island's discovery by both Earth Kingdom and Fire Nation interests created a complex situation that required diplomatic skill and moral clarity to resolve justly, yet Sozin's manipulation of the situation demonstrated his willingness to use deception and exploitation to advance Fire Nation interests, regardless of the cost to others. Roku's inadvertent killing of the Lambak clan chief during his attempt to defend Sozin represented a traumatic introduction to the deadly consequences that could result from avatar intervention, even when undertaken with the best of intentions. This tragic accident forced him to confront the reality that his growing power could cause irreparable harm, if not wielded with perfect control and judgment, a lesson that would influence his approach to avatar duties throughout his tenure. The weight of this unintended death created psychological burdens that would shape his understanding of violence and its place in avatar service. The compromise that Roku negotiated regarding Lombok Island's status demonstrated both his diplomatic skills and his growing understanding of how avatar authority could be used to create solutions that balanced competing interests while protecting vulnerable populations. However, Sozin's subsequent incorporation of the island into the Fire Nation as a special region revealed how even well-intentioned avatar interventions could be manipulated by those with sufficient political skill, ruthless determination. This early example of Sozin's willingness to subvert avatar decisions for Fire Nation benefit provided warning signs that Roku either failed to recognize or chose to ignore due to his personal affection for his childhood friend. The abolition of the Earth Sage Order during this period represented a significant shift in Earth Kingdom politics that eliminated traditional checks on royal authority, while concentrating power in ways that would prove problematic for international stability. The Night of Silent Sages created political precedents that allowed individual rulers to override established traditions and institutional wisdom when such constraints conflicted with their personal ambitions or immediate interests. The Earth King's replacement of the independent Sage Order with personally loyal Grand Electors demonstrated how democratic institutions could be corrupted through careful manipulation of selection processes and institutional structures. Sozin's ascension to Fire Lord following his father's death marked the beginning of a new era in Fire Nation politics, characterized by aggressive expansion of national capabilities and increasingly bold challenges to established international boundaries. His popularity among Fire Nation citizens reflected both his success in eliminating internal rebellions and his ability to present territorial expansion as beneficial to ordinary people rather than merely serving elite interests. The coal-powered naval developments that occurred during his early reign created technological advantages that fundamentally altered the balance of power between nations, while providing capabilities that could be used for either peaceful trade or military conquest. The tensions that arose over resource extraction and territorial claims during Sozin's consolidation of power demonstrated how technological advancement could create new sources of international conflict, even in the absence of traditional territorial disputes or ideological differences. The Fire Nation's claims to Earth Kingdom and Water Tribe territories, based on mineral rights and strategic considerations, represented a new form of imperialism that used economic justification rather than purely military reasoning to support expansion. These developments created diplomatic challenges that required Avatar intervention while also revealing the limitations of traditional approaches to international mediation. The marriage of Fire Princess Jeanne to an Airbender leader represented both a romantic choice and a political statement that challenged traditional Fire Nation approaches to international relationships and cultural purity. Her decision to renounce her title and wealth in favor of love demonstrated the kind of personal courage that Avatar philosophy encouraged, while also creating political embarrassment for Sozin that damaged his reputation among traditionalist supporters. The symbolic importance of this union extended beyond personal happiness to encompass broader questions about Fire Nation identity and its relationship with other nations and cultures. Sozin's response to his sister's marriage through the organization of dragon hunts revealed the growing influence of militaristic and aggressive tendencies in Fire Nation culture that threatened both environmental balance and spiritual harmony. The near extinction of the dragons represented not merely an ecological disaster, but also a spiritual catastrophe that severed connections between Fire Nation culture and the ancient wisdom that had originally guided their approach to elemental mastery. The transformation of dragon slaying into a recreational activity for the nobility demonstrated how traditions of respect and harmony could be corrupted into displays of dominance and destruction. The withdrawal of the Sun Warriors into complete isolation following the dragon hunts eliminated one of the last sources of traditional Fire Nation wisdom, while also depriving the world of knowledge that might have provided alternatives to the increasingly aggressive directions that Fire Nation development was taking. Their disappearance created gaps in cultural and spiritual understanding that would have profound consequences for future generations, as the loss of their teachings left Fire Nation society without internal sources of criticism or alternative perspectives on the proper use of elemental power. Roku's marriage to Ta Min represented both personal fulfillment and political alliance that strengthened his connection to Fire Nation society, while also creating emotional bonds that would influence his approach to Avatar duties. Throughout the remainder of his life, Ta Min's background as a diplomat provided her with understanding of international affairs that complemented Roku's cosmic responsibilities, while also creating a partnership based on shared values and mutual respect. Their wedding celebration, attended by Sozin as best man, seemed to symbolize the continuation of their friendship, despite the different directions their lives had taken. However, the wedding also provided Sozin with an opportunity to reveal his vision for Fire Nation expansion and global dominance, sharing plans that demonstrated how far his thinking had diverged from traditional concepts of national service and international cooperation. His presentation of worldwide Fire Nation empire as a benefit to other nations revealed both his genuine belief in Fire Nation cultural superiority and his fundamental misunderstanding of how forced cultural transformation violated basic Fire principles of human dignity and national self-determination. Roku's immediate and categorical rejection of these plans established clear boundaries that should have ended any possibility of implementing such policies. The discovery of Fire Nation colonies in Earth Kingdom and Air Nomad territory years later confirmed that Sozin had chosen to ignore Avatar authority and proceed with his expansion plans, despite Roku's explicit prohibition. This direct challenge to Avatar authority represented an unprecedented test of cosmic balance and the traditional relationship between temporal and spiritual power that had maintained international stability for generations. Roku's response to this betrayal would determine whether Avatar authority retained its effectiveness as a constraint on national ambition and aggressive expansion. The confrontation between Roku and Sozin in the Fire Nation throne room demonstrated both the awesome power of Avatar abilities and the personal cost of using such force against someone who had once been a beloved friend. Roku's destruction of the throne room and his overwhelming display of elemental mastery left no doubt about his capability to enforce his will through force if necessary, while his restraint in not harming Sozin personally reflected both his personal affection and his understanding that Avatar power should be used to correct behavior rather than to punish individuals for their mistakes. The apparent success of this intervention seemed to suggest that Avatar authority remained effective as a constraint on national ambition, as Sozin's immediate compliance with Roku's demands created the impression that the expansion plans had been permanently abandoned. However, the Fire Lord's submission reflected tactical calculation rather than genuine acceptance of Avatar authority, as he recognized that direct confrontation with Avatar power was futile, while understanding that future opportunities might present themselves under different circumstances. The volcanic eruption on Roku's home island created the circumstances that would ultimately prove fatal to the Avatar, while also providing Sozin with the opportunity he had been waiting for to eliminate the primary obstacle to his imperial ambitions. The natural disaster required Avatar intervention to protect innocent lives, while also creating conditions where Roku would be vulnerable to betrayal by someone whose assistance he had every reason to expect. The irony that Sozin's initial response to help his friend during the crisis seemed to suggest that their relationship might transcend political disagreements only made his ultimate betrayal more devastating and morally reprehensible. The collaboration between Roku and Sozin in containing the volcanic eruption demonstrated both the potential for cooperation between them and the tragic waste represented by Sozin's choice to prioritize political ambition over personal loyalty and moral responsibility. Their combined efforts successfully prevented the worst effects of the disaster while saving countless lives that would otherwise have been lost to the volcanic devastation. This brief period of partnership showed what might have been possible if Sozin had chosen different priorities and different approaches to Fire Nation leadership. Sozin's decision to abandon Roku when poisonous gases threatened the Avatar's life represented the ultimate corruption of their friendship and the definitive moment when personal ambition overcame all other considerations in the Fire Lord's moral calculus. The calculation that Roku's death would remove the primary obstacle to Fire Nation expansion revealed how thoroughly Sozin's thinking had been corrupted by imperial ambitions that valued conquest over human relationships and political power over spiritual wisdom. His willingness to watch his oldest friend die for political advantage demonstrated the complete moral bankruptcy that characterized his approach to leadership. Roku's acceptance of his approaching death while lying beside his dying dragon, Fang, reflected both his understanding of cosmic cycles and his recognition that even avatars were subject to mortality and the consequences of human choices. His final moments carried both sadness at the betrayal he had experienced and determination that his death should not prevent future avatars from maintaining the balance he had tried to preserve. The Avatar spirit's departure from his failing body carried forward both his accumulated wisdom and the unresolved conflicts that his death would create for his successor. The immediate aftermath of Roku's death created a power vacuum that Sozin was perfectly positioned to exploit through the implementation of expansion plans that had been years in development. The Fire Lord's preparation for this moment demonstrated both his long-term strategic thinking and his complete abandonment of any moral constraints that might have limited his actions. The stage was set for conflicts that would reshape the entire world while testing Avatar principles and international institutions in ways that no previous generation had experienced. The birth of Avatar Aang soon after Roku's death ensured the continuation of the Avatar cycle while also creating hope that cosmic balance might eventually be restored despite the challenges that Sozin's ambitions would create. However, the new Avatar's youth and the urgency of the developing crisis would create unprecedented pressures that would test both individual capability and institutional wisdom in ways that would define the next century of world history. The birth of Avatar Aang to the air nomads soon after Roku's death represented both hope for cosmic restoration and the beginning of an unprecedented challenge to Avatar traditions and world stability. Born into the peaceful spiritual culture of the Southern Air Temple, Aang's early years unfolded under the guidance of monk Gyatso whose wisdom and compassion provided the young Avatar with philosophical foundations that would prove crucial during the trials that lay ahead. The air nomad approach to child rearing emphasized spiritual development, intellectual curiosity, and emotional balance, creating an environment where Aang's natural talents could flourish while his character developed according to principles of nonviolence and universal compassion. Aang's prodigious abilities manifested early in his development as he demonstrated mastery of airbending techniques that typically required years of dedicated study to achieve. His invention of the air scooter represented both creative innovation and intuitive understanding of airbending principles that impressed even the most experienced masters at the temple. The achievement of his airbending tattoos at such a young age marked him as the youngest master in air nomad history, while also providing him with the spiritual markers that connected him to centuries of airbending tradition and wisdom. The freedom that characterized Aang's early years allowed him to explore the world beyond the air nomad temples, creating friendships and connections that transcended national boundaries and cultural differences. His travels introduced him to individuals like Bumi in Omashu and Kuzan in the Fire Nation, relationships that demonstrated the potential for understanding and cooperation between different peoples, despite the growing tensions that characterized international politics. These early experiences of friendship and cultural exchange would profoundly influence his approach to Avatar duties and his belief in the possibility of peaceful resolution to even the most serious conflicts. The bond that developed between Aang and his flying bison Appa represented more than mere companionship, embodying the spiritual connection between airbenders and the creatures from whom they had learned their elemental arts. Appa's loyalty and intelligence provided Aang with both practical transportation and emotional support that would prove essential during the challenging years ahead. Their relationship exemplified the air nomad philosophy of harmony with nature and mutual respect between different forms of life, creating a partnership that transcended species boundaries through shared understanding and genuine affection. However, the peaceful progression of Aang's development was disrupted by growing awareness among the air nomad elders that Fire Lord Sozin's aggressive expansion posed an existential threat to their entire civilization. The intelligence gathered about Fire Nation military preparations and territorial ambitions made it clear that traditional air nomad isolation would not protect them from the coming storm. The decision to accelerate Aang's Avatar training reflected their understanding that only fully realized Avatar power might be sufficient to prevent the catastrophic war that Sozin's policies seemed designed to initiate. The conflict between Gyatso and the other air nomad elders over Aang's training schedule revealed fundamental tensions within their philosophy regarding the balance between individual welfare and cosmic responsibility. Gyatso's insistence that Aang deserved a normal childhood reflected both his personal affection for the boy and his understanding that premature exposure to Avatar burdens could damage the psychological development necessary for effective leadership. The other elders' urgency reflected their recognition that traditional approaches to Avatar development might prove inadequate given the unprecedented nature of the threats facing their world. The revelation of Aang's avatar status 4 years earlier than normal created exactly the kind of isolation and pressure that Gyatso had feared, as other children began treating him differently once they understood his cosmic significance. The burden of expectations and the awareness that his friends viewed him as fundamentally different created emotional distress that compromised Aang's ability to develop normal social relationships. This premature identification with avatar responsibilities robbed him of the carefree experiences that might have provided psychological resilience for the challenges ahead. The decision to separate Aang from Gyatso represented the final breakdown of consensus among the Air Nomad leadership regarding appropriate avatar training methods. The other elders' belief that Gyatso's emotional attachment to Aang compromised his judgment as a teacher reflected their understanding that avatar development required objective assessment and rigorous preparation that personal affection might undermine. However, their failure to recognize the emotional support that Gyatso provided demonstrated a fundamental misunderstanding of the psychological requirements for effective avatar service. Aang's discovery of the plan to send him away created a crisis of trust that shattered his faith in the adult guidance that had previously structured his life and development. The realization that the people he trusted most were willing to separate him from his primary source of emotional support for reasons he could not understand or accept triggered the desperate flight that would define the next century of world history. His decision to run away reflected both childish impulsiveness and a deeper intuitive understanding that the path being chosen for him was fundamentally wrong. The storm that caught Aang and Appa during their flight to the South Pole created the circumstances that would preserve the Last Airbender through the catastrophic period that followed, while also depriving the world of avatar guidance during its hour of greatest need. Aang's entry into the avatar state to create the protective ice sphere that preserved both him and Appa demonstrated the unconscious wisdom of avatar power, even when wielded by an untrained child. The protective shell that formed around them created a temporal suspension that would allow them to survive the coming genocide while maintaining the avatar cycle for future restoration. Fire Lord Sozin's discovery and exploitation of the comet that bore his name represented the culmination of years of preparation for the aggressive expansion that would transform the geopolitical landscape of the entire world. The enhanced firebending capabilities provided by the comet's passage gave Fire Nation forces overwhelming advantages that rendered traditional military defenses obsolete while creating opportunities for rapid conquest that might not arise again for generations. Sozin's decision to use this cosmic event for aggressive purposes violated fundamental principles of cosmic balance, while demonstrating his complete rejection of spiritual wisdom in favor of purely material considerations. The systematic attack on all Air Nomad temples during Sozin's comment represented genocide in its most calculated and comprehensive form, designed not merely to eliminate potential military threats, but to erase an entire culture and philosophy from existence. The Fire Nation's propaganda justification for these attacks revealed the sophisticated methods used to manipulate public opinion and create support for policies that would otherwise be recognized as morally indefensible. The transformation of air nomads into supposed aggressors in the public imagination demonstrated how powerful institutions could rewrite history to serve their immediate political needs. The complete success of the air nomad genocide eliminated not only potential Avatar opposition, but also destroyed irreplaceable cultural and spiritual knowledge that had been accumulated over thousands of years. The loss of air nomad temples, libraries, and spiritual practices created gaps in human understanding that would prove difficult or impossible to restore, even after the eventual return of airbending to the world. The Fire Nation's systematic destruction of airbending artifacts and teachings demonstrated their understanding that cultural elimination required more than mere physical conquest. The simultaneous Fire Nation invasions of the Earth Kingdom and Water Tribes during this initial period of expansion revealed the comprehensive nature of Sozin's imperial ambitions, while also demonstrating the military innovations that made such rapid conquest possible. The development of advanced siege techniques, naval capabilities, and coordination between different military units allowed Fire Nation forces to overcome defensive strategies that had protected these territories for generations. The speed and effectiveness of these early conquests created momentum that would sustain Fire Nation expansion for decades to come. The establishment of Fire Nation control over captured territories required administrative and cultural policies designed to transform conquered populations into loyal subjects rather than merely subdued enemies. The systematic suppression of local traditions, languages, and institutions reflected sophisticated understanding of how cultural identity could be manipulated to serve imperial purposes. The Fire Nation's success in maintaining control over vast territories with relatively small occupying forces demonstrated the effectiveness of these cultural transformation strategies. The death of Fire Lord Sozin and succession of Fire Lord Azulon marked a transition from the initial period of conquest to the long-term administration of a global empire that required different skills and priorities than those needed for military expansion. Azulon's continuation and expansion of his father's policies demonstrated how imperial systems could perpetuate themselves beyond the lifetimes of their founders. Through institutional momentum and cultural conditioning, the development of Fire Nation educational and propaganda systems during this period created generations of citizens who genuinely believed in the moral righteousness of their nation's imperial mission. The gradual emergence of resistance movements within conquered territories reflected both the resilience of suppressed cultures and the inherent limitations of imperial control systems that relied primarily on force and intimidation. The formation of underground networks, secret schools, and hidden communities demonstrated how cultural identity could survive even under the most oppressive conditions when sustained by determined individuals willing to risk their lives for preservation of traditional values. These resistance movements would eventually provide crucial support for Avatar restoration effort. The systematic campaign against Southern Water Tribe waterbenders represented a particularly targeted form of cultural elimination designed to prevent the emergence of organized resistance while also eliminating potential threats to Fire Nation naval supremacy. The capture and imprisonment of waterbenders like Hama demonstrated both the effectiveness of these targeted campaigns and their profound psychological costs for survivors who were forced to witness the destruction of their communities and ways of life. The near-complete elimination of Southern Water Tribe bending abilities created lasting trauma that would affect generations of survivors. The political developments within the Fire Nation during this period of expansion revealed how imperial success could create internal conflicts and succession disputes that threatened the stability of the entire system. The rivalry between Iroh and Ozai over succession to the throne reflected deeper tensions between those who viewed the war as a necessary but temporary measure, and those who saw conquest as an end in itself. The personal tragedies that affected the royal family, including Lu Ten's death and Ursa's banishment, demonstrated how the costs of imperial ambition extended even to those who appeared to benefit most from its success. Ozai's rise to power through manipulation and murder marked a further escalation in the moral corruption that characterized Fire Nation leadership, while also establishing precedents for internal violence that would destabilize the imperial system from within. His willingness to eliminate family members who posed potential threats to his authority revealed the paranoia and brutality that imperial power bred even among its supposed beneficiaries. The transformation of Fire Nation culture from Sozin's vision of beneficial expansion to Ozai's pure domination reflected the inevitable corruption that accompanied unchecked power. Zuko's banishment, following his intervention in the war meeting, represented both a personal tragedy and a symbolic rejection of moral conscience within Fire Nation decision-making processes. His punishment for questioning military strategies that treated soldiers as disposable resources demonstrated how imperial systems suppressed internal criticism while perpetuating policies that served institutional interests rather than human welfare. The ritual scarring that accompanied his banishment marked him permanently as someone who had challenged authority and been found wanting according to Fire Nation standards. The impossible quest assigned to Zuko reflected Ozai's understanding that his son's moral sensibilities made him unsuitable for imperial service, while also creating an opportunity to eliminate him without direct confrontation. The search for the Avatar, believed to be dead for nearly a century, seemed designed to ensure Zuko's permanent exile, while also removing Iroh from positions where his influence might moderate Fire Nation policies. The apparent hopelessness of this mission made Zuko's eventual success all the more significant as both personal redemption and cosmic restoration. The awakening of Avatar Aang by Katara and Sokka in the Southern Water Tribe marked the beginning of the Avatar's return to a world transformed by a century of war and cultural destruction. His emergence from the iceberg created immediate opportunities for hope and resistance, while also revealing the enormous challenges that would face any attempt to restore balance to a world where imperial systems had become entrenched through generations of conditioning and institutional development. The discovery that genocide had eliminated his people created psychological trauma that would influence every aspect of his avatar service. Aang's initial encounters with the changed world revealed both the extent of Fire Nation's success and the resilience of those who had maintained their cultural identities despite imperial pressure. The survival of communities like Kyoshi Island and the persistence of traditions in places like Omashu demonstrated that Fire Nation cultural policies had not achieved complete success despite their systematic implementation. These surviving enclaves would provide crucial support for Avatar efforts to restore balance while also preserving knowledge and practices that might otherwise have been lost forever. The relationship that developed between Aang and his companions during their journey across the war-torn world created bonds that transcended the traditional boundaries between Avatar and followers. Katara's waterbending instruction provided Aang with both elemental training and emotional support that helped him process the trauma of discovering his people's fate. Sokka's strategic thinking and practical skills compensated for Aang's spiritual focus, while also demonstrating how non-benders could contribute meaningfully to Avatar missions through intelligence, planning, and moral courage. The addition of Toph to their group provided earthbending instruction while also challenging conventional assumptions about disability, age, and social status that might otherwise have limited their effectiveness. Her development of metal bending represented innovation that transcended traditional elemental boundaries, while also demonstrating how individual creativity could expand the possibilities for resistance against seemingly overwhelming imperial power. Her willingness to join their mission despite her family's opposition showed how personal courage could overcome social constraints. The discovery of Zuko's conflicted loyalties and eventual redemption created opportunities for understanding and reconciliation that transcended the simple categories of enemy and ally that characterized most wartime relationships. His journey from antagonist to teacher demonstrated the possibility of moral transformation even among those who had been deeply embedded in imperial systems. His knowledge of Fire Nation culture and politics provided insights that would prove crucial for understanding and ultimately defeating the imperial system from within. The final confrontations that ended the 100-Year War represented both military victory and moral triumph, as Avatar principles proved capable of overcoming imperial power through combination of strength, wisdom, and spiritual insight. Aang's decision to spare Ozai's life while removing his bending abilities demonstrated how Avatar solutions could transcend the simple choice between destruction and submission that characterizes most conflicts. The restoration of balance required not merely defeating enemies, but creating conditions where former adversaries could contribute positively to rebuild societies. The post-war reconstruction efforts revealed both the possibilities and challenges associated with transforming imperial systems into cooperative international relationships. The Harmony Restoration Movement's initial attempts to simply remove Fire Nation colonies created new problems that required more sophisticated solutions than mere reversal of imperial policies. The eventual creation of the United Republic demonstrated how creative political solutions could emerge from Avatar wisdom, combined with practical understanding of complex social realities. The establishment of new institutions like the Metal Bending Academy and Air Acolyte communities reflected efforts to preserve and expand knowledge while also adapting ancient traditions to contemporary needs and opportunities. These developments showed how cultural restoration could transcend simple recreation of past conditions to create new forms of wisdom and practice that built upon traditional foundations while addressing modern challenges and possibilities. The Avatar timeline reveals the eternal truth that each generation must face its own darkness while building upon the wisdom of those who came before. From Wan's desperate sacrifice to create balance between warring cosmic forces, through Yang Chen's political innovations that bridged nations in crisis, to Kyoshi's unflinching commitment to justice, regardless of personal cost. Each incarnation brought unique gifts to an ever-changing world. Kuruk's hidden battles against spiritual corruption, Roku's tragic friendship with those who would betray cosmic trust, and Aang's preservation of hope during humanity's darkest century demonstrated how individual choices could reshape the destiny of entire civilizations. In their struggles, we find our own reflections. In their triumphs, we discover what becomes possible when beings choose courage over comfort, compassion over conquest, and wisdom over mere power. The Avatar's story transcends simple heroism to become something far more profound, a testament to the capacity for growth, redemption, and transformation that exists within every soul willing to accept responsibility for something greater than personal ambition. The cycle continues beyond what mortal eyes can see, carrying forward the accumulated wisdom of 10,000 years, while adapting to challenges that no previous generation could have imagined. As new benders emerge and ancient wisdoms resurface, as spirits and humans learn to coexist in evolving harmony, the wheel of time turns onward. The Avatar endures not as a perfect being, but as a bridge between worlds, a reminder that even in our darkest moments, the light within us can illuminate the path toward balance, understanding, and hope.